Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we begin a story that lives quite literally on your skin. It is the story of soap and water, of hands held under a stream, of a simple act so woven into your daily life that you perform it without thought. And yet behind that act lies centuries of fear and forgetting, of plagues that emptied cities, of a doctor who saw the truth and was destroyed for speaking it, and of radio dramas named for the very product that taught a nation to scrub. What if the history of civilization could be traced not through its wars or its monuments, but through its relationship with dirt, through the slow, strange, sometimes heartbreaking journey humanity took to understand that the invisible things clinging to our hands could kill us, and that the simplest remedy had been within reach all along. If you enjoy what we do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find these journeys helpful for your nights, and if you are listening from somewhere special tonight, a bedroom in a city far from mine, a couch with a sleeping dog, a long drive through the dark, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing where these words travel. Now settle in. Dim the lights if you have not already. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or let the silence of your room wrap around you. Pull the covers up if you need them. Tonight we're going a long way back, to the banks of an ancient river, to the smell of incense and animal blood, to hands raised in prayer that had first been dipped in sacred water. And from there we will walk forward through time, through centuries of filth and faith, through wards full of dying mothers and the man who tried to save them, through advertising jingles and radio melodramas, until we arrive, at last, at the sink in your own home. Let us begin. The Tiber River in the age of the Caesars was not the colour you might imagine. It ran brown and sluggish through the heart of Rome, fed by mountain streams but thickened by the city it served, by the runoff of a million lives, by the silt of construction, by the waste of empire. And yet to the Romans this muddy water was holy. The river had a god. His name was Tiberinus, and he had watched over these banks since before the city rose, since the hills were pasture land and the wolves still roamed. To dip your hands into the Tiber was to touch something older than law, older than the Senate, older than the stone roads that would one day stretch to the edges of the known world. And so they washed. Before a priest could approach the altar, before the knife could touch the throat of the sacrifice, before the sacred words could leave his lips, he washed his hands. This was not optional. This was not preference. This was the law of heaven as the Romans understood it, that the divine could not be approached with the grime of the workday still clinging to your skin. The hands had to be clean, the garments had to be fresh, the body had to be made ready. Only then could a mortal stand in the presence of the gods and not give offence. The ritual was precise. Water was drawn or poured, the hands were submerged or sprinkled. Sometimes the head was touched as well, 3 times, in acknowledgement of the sacred space being entered. When a woman named Claudia Quinta stood accused of impurity in the old stories, her virtue questioned, her reputation hanging by a thread, she proved her innocence through an act bound up with this same river. She reached for the cable of a sacred ship that had run aground, a ship bearing the image of the goddess Cybele, and she pulled. The ship moved. Her hands, she had told the crowd, were clean. The river itself would testify. The evidence from these centuries, when examined carefully, reveals something both familiar and strange. The Romans washed constantly. They built aqueducts to carry water across valleys and mountains, some of them spanning miles, some of them still standing 2,000 years later. They constructed public baths that could hold thousands of bathers at once, complexes with heated pools and cold plunge basins, with libraries and gardens and spaces for conversation and commerce. A citizen of Rome could spend half a day at the baths without ever growing bored. The water flowed, the bodies were scrubbed, the hands were rinsed and rinsed again. And yet, and here is the first great irony of our story, they did not wash because they feared disease. They did not scrub because they understood that invisible particles clung to the skin and could pass from one body to another. The germ had not been discovered. The microscope had not been invented. The connection between dirt and death, so obvious to us now, lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for centuries to be named. No, the Romans washed because it was holy. They washed because the gods demanded it. They washed because to approach the sacred with dirty hands was an insult, a breach of cosmic etiquette, a way of saying that you did not take the divine seriously. The symbolism was clear. Dirt was the world of labour and commerce, of sweat and grasping and struggle. Clean hands marked the transition from that ordinary world into the realm of the gods. You could not carry the marketplace into the temple. You had to leave it at the threshold, rinsed away, dripping from your fingers into the basin. Persons who attended a Roman funeral understood this instinctively. Before they could perform the last rites for the dead, before they could speak the words, make the offerings and send the spirit on its way, they had to wash their hands in pure water. The dead were sacred too in their own way. The boundary between the living and the dead was as charged as the boundary between mortal and divine, and crossing it required the same preparation. Clean hands, fresh garments, the grime of the world left behind. So here, at the very beginning of our story, we find the central thread that will run through everything that follows. Humanity has always sensed, in some deep and wordless way, that dirty hands carry danger. The Romans encoded this intuition into their religion, their architecture, their daily habits. They built a civilization around flowing water and frequent washing. They understood that something important happened when hands were cleaned, that a transformation occurred, a purification, a passage from one state to another, and then, when the understanding might have deepened, when the symbol might have become science, the empire fell. The aqueducts cracked, the bathhouses emptied, the water stopped flowing, and Europe began its long, strange journey into filth. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse all at once. It frayed, it crumbled. It was nibbled at the edges by peoples the Romans had once dismissed as barbarians, and it rotted from within through corruption and plague and the sheer exhaustion of trying to hold together a world that had grown too large to govern. By the end of the 5th century, the last emperor had been deposed, and the political structures that had maintained the aqueducts, the roads, the baths, and the sewers began to dissolve like salt in water. The aqueducts fell silent within decades. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy to read past the sentence without grasping what it meant. An aqueduct is not just a pipe. It is a monument to collective effort. A stone river built by thousands of hands over years or decades, requiring constant maintenance to keep the water flowing. The joints must be sealed. The channels must be cleared of sediment. The arches must be repaired when they crack. When the empire fell, the engineers who understood these systems scattered or died, and the tax revenues that had paid for their work vanished. Most aqueducts gradually decayed for want of maintenance. They developed leaks, they clogged, they broke at their junctions and created swamps and marshes where once there had been controlled flow. And without the aqueducts, the baths could not function. The great complexes that had served millions of Romans for centuries became empty shells, their pools stagnant, their furnaces cold. A generation might still remember what it had been like to spend an afternoon in the warm water, surrounded by neighbours and friends, but their children would know only the ruins, the broken columns, the dry basins filled with debris. This would have been tragedy enough, the loss of a civilization's infrastructure, the forgetting of engineering knowledge that would take 1,000 years to rediscover. But what happened next was not simply neglect. It was, in its own way, a choice. A new set of beliefs began to reshape how people thought about the body, about water, about the act of washing itself. And those beliefs came from the institution that would dominate European life for the next millennium, the Church. The early Christians had inherited the Jewish tradition of ritual bathing, of purification through water, of the mikveh and the baptismal font. And yet, as the Church grew in power and complexity, its relationship with the body became tangled and troubled. The flesh was suspect. The body was the site of temptation, of lust, of the sins that could drag the soul down to hell. And bathing, that Roman luxury, that pagan indulgence, began to seem dangerous in a new way. Not dangerous because of disease, dangerous because of pleasure. Church views throughout the Middle Ages often condemned bathing as a sinful vanity. The reasoning was complex, and not all clerics agreed. Some churches and monasteries built and maintained baths for the poor and sick, and many senior churchmen also created splendid bath suites for themselves, suggesting that the rules, as always, bent for those with power. But the theological current ran against the body and its comforts. Many monks shunned bathing entirely. The Penitential of Burchard of Worms, written around the year 1000, catalogued the many sinful temptations that could arise from mixed bathing: the proximity of bodies, the nakedness, the warmth, the opportunity for lust to take root. And there was something more, something that takes us deeper into the medieval mind. For some of the faithful, bodily filth itself became a mark of holiness. To reject the world meant to reject its pleasures, and what greater pleasure was there than the simple comfort of being clean? The ascetics who fled into the desert, who lived on pillars or in caves, who mortified their flesh through fasting and exposure. These were the heroes of the age. Their unwashed bodies were proof of their commitment, their distance from the corruptions of civilization, their closeness to God. We must be careful here, because the evidence for specific stories, for individual saints crawling with lice at death, for particular theologians celebrating filth, is harder to verify than we might wish. The medieval world left us chronicles and hagiographies, but these were written with purposes of their own, purposes that did not always align with what we would call historical accuracy. What we can say, with confidence, is that the infrastructure of bathing collapsed, that the theological climate shifted against the body, and that the result was a Europe far dirtier than the Rome that had preceded it. Consider what it meant practically to live without aqueducts. A Roman citizen could bathe daily without ever carrying a bucket. The water came to him, flowing through channels and pipes, heated by furnaces, available in quantities that stagger the modern imagination. A medieval peasant, by contrast, would have to haul every drop of water from a well or a stream. Heating it required fuel, wood or peat, which was precious. The labour of filling a basin, warming the water, and then disposing of it afterward was not trivial. Bathing became something you did rarely, if at all. A few times a year, perhaps, or only on special occasions. And without regular bathing, other habits changed too. Hands that might have been washed before meals were simply wiped on clothing. Faces went unwiped for days. The accumulated grime of labour and life built up on the skin in layers, and this became normal, became unremarkable, became the baseline from which no one thought to deviate. The sensory experience of daily life shifted in ways that are hard for us to imagine now. The smells sharper, the textures rougher, the whole weight of the body heavier with the residue of unwash. The transition did not happen overnight. It took generations, perhaps centuries, for the Roman habits to fully fade. And it happened unevenly. Cities retained some access to water longer than the countryside, and the wealthy could always afford servants to carry buckets. But the overall direction was clear. Europe was becoming a place where washing was rare, where bathing was suspect, where the body was left largely to its own devices. And this was not because people were ignorant. It was not because they did not know any better. It was because the ideological foundations had shifted beneath them, because the structures that had made bathing possible had crumbled, because the very meaning of cleanliness had changed. The river still flowed, streams still wound through valleys, and wells could still be dug. But the civilization that had built stone channels to carry water across 100 miles was gone, and with it went a certain relationship with the body, a certain comfort with cleaning, a certain innocence about the dangers that dirty hands could carry. The groundwork was being laid, silently, invisibly, over centuries, for catastrophes yet to come. Let us land now in a very specific place, at a very specific time. The year is 1348, the city is London, and the smell, if you could be transported there somehow, if you could walk those streets in the body you inhabit now, the smell would stop you in your tracks. We speak often of the past as if it were simply the present with different costumes. We imagine medieval people as ourselves in funny hats, living in older buildings, using outdated technology, but otherwise recognizable. This is a mistake. The past was a foreign country in ways we struggle to comprehend, and one of the most foreign things about it, one of the things that would strike you most immediately, most viscerally, most inescapably, was the smell. London in the 14th century was a city of perhaps 50,000 people, maybe more in prosperous years, crammed into a space we would now consider a small neighbourhood. The houses were built close together, leaning over narrow streets, their upper stories jutting out to steal a few more feet of floor space. The streets themselves were unpaved, turning to mud in rain and dust in drought, and running down the centre of many of them were open channels, gutters, drains, whatever you wish to call them, carrying the waste of the city toward the river, carrying it slowly, carrying it incompletely, often not carrying it at all but simply letting it accumulate, pool, fester, and stink. The rivers of the two major European cities, London and Paris, were open sewers. This was not a figure of speech. This was literal fact. The Thames, which had once been Rome's distant cousin in holiness, which had watered the fields and supported the fisheries and given the city its reason for being, had become a dumping ground for everything the city wished to be rid of. Butchers threw the offal of slaughtered animals directly into the water, the intestines, the blood, the parts that could not be sold. Tanners dumped the chemical waste of their trade, the caustic mixtures used to strip hair from hides, dyers released their coloured effluent, and the household waste of 50,000 people found its way, by one route or another, into that same brown flow. In 1372, a generation after the time we are now visiting, but proof of how persistent the problem was, King Edward III of England was forced to issue a proclamation. He declared that throwing rushes, dung, refuse and other filth and harmful things into the Thames should no longer be allowed. The very existence of this proclamation tells us everything we need to know about what had been happening. The King of England had to order his subjects by royal decree to stop using the river as a garbage dump. And even then, as with so many royal decrees, compliance was spotty at best. Paris was no better. The great city on the Seine, the jewel of medieval France, the home of Notre Dame and the university, was equally awash in its own waste. Open drains were sometimes known as split streets, because the wastewater running down the middle physically divided the thoroughfare into two halves. You walked on one side or the other, trying not to step in the stream of filth that flowed between. Chamber pots, the vessels people used for their bodily needs at night, when leaving the house for the outdoor latrine was impractical or dangerous, were emptied directly into the streets each morning. The phrase "gardez l'eau," or "guard the water," became a warning cry shouted from upper windows before the contents came splashing down. Listen for it, and you might dodge in time. Fail to hear it, and you would wear the consequences. The smell of these cities was not a single smell. It was a symphony of smells, each instrument playing its own foul note. There was the rotting vegetation, the decomposing animal matter, the human waste in its various stages of freshness and decay. There was the smoke from thousands of hearth fires burning wood and peat and coal. There was the yeasty tang of breweries, the metallic bite of forges, the sour reek of unwashed bodies packed into close quarters, and underneath it all, pervading everything, was the smell of the river itself, that slow brown presence carrying the city's secrets toward the sea. People adapted, as people always do. The nose, that most adaptable of organs, learned to stop registering what it could not escape. The permanent residents of London and Paris no longer noticed what a visitor from the countryside might gag on. The smell became invisible, became normal, became simply the way the world was. And this is important to understand because it meant that no one was looking for a connection between the filth and the death. No one was asking whether the stench itself might be more than unpleasant, whether it might be deadly, or rather, they were asking, but they were asking the wrong question. The theory that dominated medical thinking in this era, that would dominate it for centuries more, was the theory of miasma. The word comes from the Greek, meaning pollution or defilement. The idea was simple, intuitive, and entirely wrong. Disease came from bad air. Sickness arose when people breathed in the foul vapours that rose from swamps, from rotting matter, from the accumulated filth of cities. The miasma entered the body through the nose and mouth, disrupted the balance of the humours, and caused illness. This theory had the advantage of explaining what people could observe with their own senses. Cities smelled terrible, and cities had more disease. Swamps smelled terrible, and people who lived near swamps got sick. The connection seemed obvious. The smell was the warning, and the warning was the danger. If you could avoid the bad air, if you could burn sweet-smelling herbs to mask the stench, if you could flee to the countryside when plague threatened, you might survive. The miasma theory placed the danger in the air, not on the hands, not in the water, not in the invisible particles that passed from body to body through touch and breath. And so when the plague came, when the Black Death arrived in England in August of 1348, having already swept through Asia and the Mediterranean, having already killed millions, the people of London had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. They knew only that the air had become even more dangerous than usual, that the miasma was somehow thicker and more lethal, and that their neighbours were dying at a rate that defied comprehension. The disease reached epidemic proportions by the end of September. Within months, something like half the city's population was dead. The numbers are hard to know precisely. Record keeping in the midst of catastrophe is never complete. But the estimates suggest that between 1347 and 1351, roughly 25 million people died across Europe. Some historians place the figure higher, at 30 to 50% of the entire population. Imagine 1 out of every 3 people you know simply gone. Imagine the houses standing empty, the fields unploughed, the bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. The gravediggers could not keep up. Mass graves were dug, long trenches into which the dead were laid into rows, layer upon layer, until the trench was full and another had to be started. The churches overflowed with mourners, and then the churches themselves became places of death as the disease spread among the congregants who had gathered to pray for deliverance. Physicians died alongside their patients, their masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, doing nothing to stop the invisible enemy they could not name. And through it all, the miasma theory held. The bad air was blamed. The stench was feared. The idea that the disease might pass from person to person through touch, through the fleas on the rats that thrived in the filth of the city, through the very contact that human beings could not avoid. This idea did not take hold. Could not take hold because the conceptual framework did not exist. The germ had not been discovered. The microscope had not been invented. The invisible world of microbes remained invisible, doing its deadly work while the scholars blamed the alignment of the planets and the corruption of the atmosphere. The first closed sewer constructed in Paris was built in 1370, not to prevent disease, but to hold back the stench. The goal was containment of the smell, not the waste. The engineers who designed it were still operating within the miasma theory, still believing that if they could just control the bad air, they could control the sickness. They were right in one narrow sense. Reducing the filth did reduce the smell, and reducing the smell did make life marginally more bearable. But they were wrong in the way that mattered most. The danger was not in the air. The danger was in the contact, and that truth would take 5 more centuries to be understood and accepted. The river kept flowing. The Thames carried its burden of filth toward the estuary and the sea. The survivors buried their dead, mourned their losses, and slowly rebuilt their lives in a city that now had room to spare. And the miasma theory, unshaken, continued to rule the world. It would rule for centuries more, shaping how people thought about sickness and health, about dirt and danger, about the simple act of washing hands. The Romans had washed for the gods. The medieval Europeans had stopped washing for the soul. And neither had understood what was actually at stake. The stage was set now, not for understanding, not yet, but for the long sequence of tragedies that would finally force the truth into the light. Somewhere in the future, a doctor would stand in a hospital in Vienna and watch women die by the thousands. He would see what no one else could see, or what no one else would admit to seeing. He would beg his colleagues to wash their hands, and they would destroy him for it. But that story lies ahead. For now the city reeks, the graves are full, and the miasma hangs in the air like a curse that no amount of burning herbs can lift. The water that might have washed the danger away flows unused through the gutters, carrying waste instead of hope, while the people who walk those streets have no idea that the remedy they need is sitting in the very substance they have learned to fear and ignore. The centuries turn, the smell endures, and somewhere in the darkness the invisible killers wait for their next opportunity. The great irony, if you step back far enough to see it, is that humanity had already solved this problem once. The Romans had built their aqueducts, they had filled their baths, they had washed their hands before approaching the sacred, and in doing so they had, without knowing it, without understanding why, protected themselves from dangers they could not name. The water carried away what the gods did not want to see, and it carried away, incidentally, the microbes that might have killed. And then the knowledge was lost. Not the knowledge of how to build an aqueduct that could be relearned and eventually was, but the habit of washing, the cultural assumption that clean hands were better than dirty ones, the infrastructure of water and bathing that had made hygiene possible for millions. All of this crumbled with the empire, was buried under centuries of theological suspicion and practical impossibility, and left Europe vulnerable to plagues it could not understand and could not stop. The river still flowed through Rome, brown and patient, carrying its memories of holiness and its burden of waste. The river still flowed through London, darker now, thicker now, a highway of refuse. And between those two rivers, between the sacred Tiber and the polluted Thames, lay 1,000 years of forgetting, of ideology dressed as piety, of choices made for reasons that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with how a civilization understood its own body. The great unwashing was not ignorance. It was, in its strange way, a kind of faith. Faith that the soul mattered more than the flesh. Faith that the pleasures of the body were traps laid by the devil. Faith that to scrub and soak and preen was to court the sin of vanity, to indulge the very appetites that a good Christian should mortify and subdue. And then the faith was tested by fire, or rather by plague, by buboes swelling in the groin and armpit, by skin turning black with hemorrhage, by death that came so fast and struck so widely that the living could not keep up with the burying of the dead. The medieval world did not learn the lesson that we, with our microscopes and our laboratories, might think it should have learned. The filth did not get cleaned. The miasma theory did not fall. The washing did not resume. Instead, the survivors picked their way through the emptied streets, stepped over the bodies and went on living in the same conditions that had made the catastrophe possible. The smell returned to normal, the gutters filled again, and the next plague, when it came, found a population just as vulnerable as before. It would take something more than plague to break the pattern. It would take a man standing in a hospital, watching women die, and having the audacity to ask why. But that story is for another night, another chapter in this long, slow walk through time. For now, settle deeper into your pillow, let your breathing slow. The river flows on, as it always has, as it always will, indifferent to empires, indifferent to plagues, carrying its waters toward the sea in the same patient rhythm that has marked the centuries since before the first stone was laid. The Romans are gone. The medieval dead are dust. The streets of London have been paved and repaved 12 times over, the gutters sealed, the waste redirected through pipes and tunnels that the medieval mind could not have imagined. But the story is not over, it has barely begun. Somewhere ahead lies Vienna, and a ward full of dying mothers, and a doctor named Semmelweis, who will see what others cannot bear to see. Somewhere ahead lies the laboratory where Pasteur will peer through his microscope and find the invisible world at last. Somewhere ahead lies a radio studio where actors will perform melodramas sponsored by soap companies, and the phrase soap opera will enter the language, and the anxiety about dirty hands will become something that can be packaged and sold. All of that lies ahead. For now the night is quiet, and the river flows, and the centuries turn like pages in a book that someone is reading very, very slowly. Rest now. We will continue the walk tomorrow. The centuries did turn slowly, page by page, and the river kept flowing, and the dead stayed buried, and the living went on breathing the air they believed was making them sick. Because that was the thing, you see. The medieval world did not simply shrug and accept that plagues came from nowhere and vanished into nowhere. The medieval world had a theory, a very old theory, handed down from the greatest physicians who had ever lived, endorsed by every medical school, every royal physician, every learned man who had ever contemplated the mystery of disease. The theory was coherent, the theory was elegant, the theory explained everything the medieval eye could observe, and the theory was, as we now know, almost entirely wrong. They called it miasma. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek, meaning pollution, or staining, or defilement, and the idea behind it was beautifully simple. Disease came from bad air, not from touch, not from contamination, not from anything you could see or feel, but from the invisible corruption that rose from rotting matter and hung in the atmosphere like an evil mist. Breathe that mist and you would sicken. Escape that mist and you would be spared. This was not the fevered imagination of ignorant peasants. This was science. This was medicine at its most authoritative and systematic. Hippocrates himself, the father of Western medicine, had proposed the theory in the 4th century before the Common Era, arguing that epidemics arose from air that contained miasmata, particles of decaying organic matter that entered the body through the lungs and disrupted the delicate balance of the humours. Galen, the great Roman physician whose writings dominated European medicine for more than 1,000 years, elaborated and refined the theory in the 2nd century of the Common Era, describing how atmospheric corruption could penetrate the body and produce every manner of sickness. When medieval physicians opened their textbooks, when Renaissance doctors debated the causes of plague, when Enlightenment scholars sought to understand why some cities sickened while others thrived, they were all working within the framework that Hippocrates and Galen had established more than a millennium before. And the framework made sense. That was the terrible thing about it. The framework actually made sense if you looked at the world with medieval eyes and medieval instruments and medieval assumptions about how nature worked. Disease did seem to cluster around foul-smelling places. Epidemics did seem to break out in crowded cities with open sewers and rotting garbage and stagnant pools where refuse collected and festered. The poor, who lived in the most fetid conditions, did seem to die in greater numbers than the wealthy, who could afford to flee to country estates where the air was fresh and the stench of civilization did not reach. If you believed that the nose was a reliable guide to danger, if you believed that what smelled bad must be bad, then miasma theory was not just plausible, but almost self-evident. The correlation was right there in front of you, every time you walked down a medieval street and gagged on the smell, and so the authorities acted on the theory. When plague threatened, city officials would order bonfires lit in the public squares, not to burn the bodies of the dead but to purify the air, to drive out the corrupted atmosphere with smoke and flame. They would order aromatic herbs scattered through the streets, rosemary and juniper and bay leaves, anything that smelled strong enough to overpower the stench of decay. They would order citizens to carry pouches of lavender and cloves and dried oranges studded with spices, holding them to their noses as they walked, breathing through the fragrance to filter out the miasma. They would order houses fumigated with vinegar and burning pitch, the acrid smoke meant to cleanse the rooms where the sick had lain. They would drain the marshes and dredge the canals and cart away the garbage, not because they understood bacterial contamination, but because they understood stench, and stench was the enemy. The plague doctors became the most vivid symbol of this medical worldview. You have seen the images, perhaps, in old engravings and modern Halloween costumes. The long black robes, the wide-brimmed hats, the strange beaked masks that made them look like enormous ravens stalking through the streets of the dying. Those masks were not theatrical. Those masks were functional, or at least they were believed to be functional. The beak was hollow, and it was filled with dried flowers, herbs, camphor, cloves, laudanum, myrrh, rose petals, and other strong-smelling substances. The physician would breathe through this fragrant filter, inhaling the scent of lavender and spice instead of the miasma of plague, protected by perfume from the invisible corruption that hung in the air around the sick and the dead. Did it work? In the way they intended, no. Lavender does not kill bacteria. Cloves do not neutralize pathogens. The plague was not carried on bad air, and no amount of aromatic filtering could stop the fleas that actually transmitted the disease from rat to human to human through blood and bite and contact. But here is the strange and ironic thing. In another way, the miasma theory may have accidentally saved some lives, because physicians who believed that disease came from the air were also physicians who believed in keeping their distance from the sick. They examined patients from across the room whenever possible. They used long wooden sticks to lift bedclothes and inspect sores without touching the afflicted flesh. They covered themselves from head to toe in heavy robes and gloves, not to prevent contamination in the modern sense, but to create a barrier against the supposedly poisonous atmosphere. And all of this distance, all of this reluctance to touch, may have reduced some transmission of diseases that were in fact spread through contact. The theory was wrong, but the behaviour it produced was, in some cases, accidentally helpful. This is one of the strange ironies of medical history. The right action can follow from the wrong reason. The wrong action can follow from the right reason. And for centuries, European medicine stumbled forward in this fog of accidental correlation, an elegant but mistaken theory, occasionally doing good without understanding why, more often doing nothing at all, and sometimes doing active harm in the name of science. The sanitary reformers of the 18th and 19th centuries were the heirs of this tradition. When they campaigned for cleaner cities, for covered sewers, for the removal of garbage and the drainage of swamps, they were still working within the miasma framework. They believed they were purifying the air. They believed that eliminating foul odours would eliminate disease. And they were, in a sense, correct, though not for the reasons they imagined. Clean water does reduce cholera, not because clean water smells better, but because clean water is not contaminated with the bacterium that causes cholera. Removing garbage does reduce plague, Not because garbage smells bad, but because garbage attracts the rats that carry the fleas that carry the plague. The sanitary movement of the 1800s produced real improvements in public health, built the infrastructure that would eventually make modern hygiene possible, and did so while operating under a theory that was fundamentally mistaken about the mechanism of disease. This is the world that Ignaz Semmelweis was born into. A world where the smartest physicians, the most educated authorities, the most enlightened reformers all agreed that disease came from the air. A world where the idea that disease might come from touch, from hands, from the invisible particles transferred on skin and instrument and cloth, was not just unproven, but almost unthinkable. A world where a young doctor who dared to suggest that his colleagues were killing their patients with their own unwashed hands would be met not with curiosity but with fury, not with investigation but with denial, not with gratitude but with contempt. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let the river carry us forward a little more slowly. Let the centuries turn their final pages, and let us arrive at last at Vienna. The city rises along the Danube, that other great European river, flowing eastward through the heart of the continent as the Thames flows through London and the Tiber flows through Rome. Vienna in the 1840s is a city of empire, the capital of the vast Habsburg domains that stretch across Central Europe and into the Italian peninsula, a city of palaces and coffee houses and opera houses, and, importantly for our story, a city of hospitals. The Vienna General Hospital is one of the largest in Europe, a sprawling complex of buildings where the sick and the poor come to receive what treatment the medicine of the age can offer. And within that complex there are 2 maternity clinics, 2 wards where women come to give birth, 2 places that should be, by all logic, essentially identical in their outcomes. They are not. The first obstetrical clinic is staffed by physicians and medical students. Young men studying to become doctors rotate through its wards, learning the art of obstetrics, practicing the techniques of delivery, gaining the experience they will need to treat patients of their own someday. The second obstetrical clinic is staffed by midwives, women training in the traditional practice of assisting childbirth, learning from older midwives, working in a ward that is in most respects nearly indistinguishable from the first. The same hospital, the same city, the same population of patients, the same decade, the same weather, the same general conditions of life. And yet the women who give birth in the first clinic are dying at a rate that defies comprehension. The first clinic has an average maternal mortality rate of about 10%. 10%. 1 in 10 women who enters that ward to give birth will leave it in a coffin. And in the worst years, the years before Semmelweis arrives, the rate climbs even higher, toward 13%, toward 18%, toward numbers that represent not a medical service but a death sentence. From 1840 through 1846, the maternal mortality rate in the first clinic averages 98.4 deaths per 1,000 births, nearly 100 women dead for every 1,000 who deliver. The second clinic, the midwives' ward, averages less than 4%, 36.2 deaths per 1,000 births. Still terrible by modern standards, still a roll of the dice that no pregnant woman today would willingly accept. But compared to the first clinic, the second clinic is a haven. Compared to the physician's ward, the midwives' ward is safety itself. The women of Vienna know this. The poor women who have no choice but to deliver their babies in the charity wards of the General Hospital, women without the means to hire private physicians or retreat to comfortable homes, women who must accept whatever bed the hospital assigns them, these women know which clinic is which. They know the reputation. They know the numbers, even if they do not know the percentages. They know that the first clinic is the ward of death. Patients are assigned to the 2 clinics on alternate days. If you arrive on a Monday, you go to the first clinic. If you arrive on a Tuesday, you go to the second. The rotation is mechanical, indifferent, bureaucratic. It takes no account of which ward has the better survival rate. It simply divides the incoming patients by the calendar, sending half to the physicians and half to the midwives, as if the 2 destinations were equivalent, as if the day of the week were a neutral factor in whether a woman and her baby would live or die. And so the women try to time their arrivals. They linger outside the hospital doors waiting for the day to change, waiting for the moment when they will be admitted to the second clinic instead of the first. They plead with the administrators, they weep, they fall to their knees. Semmelweis himself will later describe desperate women begging on their knees not to be admitted to the first clinic, women who understood something that the physicians themselves could not or would not see. Women who knew that the hands reaching out to help them might instead be carrying death. The disease that kills them is called puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection that sets in after delivery, that begins with chills and fever and abdominal pain, that progresses to delirium and organ failure and death, that strikes within days of what should have been the happiest moment of a woman's life, and turns it into the last moment of her life. The name comes from the Latin puerperium, the period immediately following childbirth, and the fever comes like a thief in that vulnerable window, attacking women whose bodies are exhausted from labour, whose immune systems are depleted, whose wounds from delivery have not yet begun to heal. Physicians have known about puerperal fever for centuries. Hippocrates described it. Galen discussed it. Every generation of obstetricians since has watched women die from it and struggled to understand why. The explanations have varied. Bad humours, atmospheric conditions, miasma in the wards, weakness of constitution, moral failing, divine punishment. Some physicians have blamed the women themselves, suggesting that those who died must have violated some rule of diet or behaviour or modesty that left them vulnerable to the disease. Others have blamed the weather, the season, the phase of the moon, the configuration of the stars. But no one in the 1840s has seriously suggested that the physicians themselves might be the cause. No one has looked at the bright young medical students rotating through the first clinic and asked what they are bringing into the ward on their hands. No one has connected the fact that these students spend their mornings dissecting cadavers in the anatomy theatre, cutting open the bodies of the dead to study muscle and bone and organ, and then proceed directly to the maternity ward to examine living women in labour. No one has noticed that the students rarely wash their hands between these activities, or that the sweet, rotting smell of the dissecting room clings to their fingers and their sleeves, or that this smell is exactly the miasma that everyone agrees causes disease. The smell is there, the correlation is there, and yet the conclusion does not follow because the theory does not permit it. Miasma comes from the air, not from the hands. Disease enters through the breath, not through the birth canal. A physician who's been handling corpses may smell like death, but smell is not transmission, and to suggest otherwise would be to accuse one's colleagues of murder. This is the ward that Ignaz Semmelweis inherits. This is the puzzle that will consume him. He arrives on July 1st, 1846, appointed as assistant to Professor Johann Klein, the director of the first clinic. He is 28 years old, a Hungarian by birth, a Viennese by training, a young man with the standard education of his time and the standard assumptions of his profession. He believes in miasma. He believes in the humoral theory of disease. He believes at this point more or less what every other physician in Europe believes, but he also has eyes. And what his eyes see, in his first weeks and months in the ward, is something that his beliefs cannot explain. Women are dying. Women are dying in numbers that mock every theory of atmospheric corruption and seasonal variation and constitutional weakness. Women are dying in the first clinic at rates that do not occur in the second clinic, even though the two clinics share the same air, the same building, the same city, the same season. Women are dying after being examined by medical students who have come straight from the dissecting room, their hands unwashed, their coats stained with the fluids of the dead. Semmelweis begins to keep records. He begins to track the deaths, to note the patterns, to look for correlations that others have missed. He rules out overcrowding, because the second clinic is just as crowded. He rules out diet, because the women in both clinics eat the same food. He rules out laundry practices, ventilation, the position of the beds, the skill of the attendants. Every variable he can think of he examines and eliminates, and always he returns to the same stubborn, inexplicable fact. The doctor's ward kills more women than the midwives' ward. The midwives do not dissect cadavers. The midwives do not spend their mornings up to their elbows in dead flesh. The midwives wash their hands with ordinary soap and water, not because they understand anything about germs, but because washing is part of their routine, part of the rhythm of their work, part of what midwives have always done. The midwives touch living women with hands that have not recently touched the dead. Could that be the difference? Could the hands themselves be carrying something, some particle, some invisible contamination from the corpse to the patient? The idea is forming in Semmelweis's mind. It has not yet crystallized into certainty. He has not yet found the proof that will make the connection undeniable, but the question is there, hovering at the edge of his consciousness, waiting for the moment that will bring it into focus. That moment is coming. It will arrive with the death of a friend, a colleague, a man who will cut his finger during an autopsy and die of the same symptoms that kill the women in the maternity ward. It will arrive with a flash of terrible insight, a recognition that will change Semmelweis's life and, eventually, change medicine forever. But the moment is not yet here. For now, Semmelweis walks the wards, counts the deaths, watches the women beg not to be admitted, and wonders why. For now, the miasma theory still reigns, still explains, still offers its elegant and mistaken account of how disease moves through the world. For now, the medical students continue their rotations, from the anatomy theatre to the maternity ward and back again, carrying on their hands the invisible seeds of death, washing nothing, suspecting nothing, killing without knowing that they kill. The river flows on. The Danube moves through Vienna as the Tiber moved through Rome, as the Thames moves through London, indifferent to the theories of physicians, indifferent to the deaths of mothers, carrying its waters eastward toward the Black Sea in the same patient rhythm that has marked the centuries since before the first stone of the city was laid. Settle deeper into your pillow now. Let the weight of the blankets press you gently into the mattress. The story is pausing here, at this moment of gathering mystery, at this threshold where a young doctor stands on the edge of a discovery that will save countless lives and destroy his own. The women are still dying. Semmelweis is still watching. The answer is there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the tragedy that will make it visible. But that tragedy and that revelation will wait for another night. For now, rest. The ward is quiet. The Danube flows. The centuries have brought us this far, from the sacred waters of the Tiber to the fatal wards of Vienna, and they will carry us further still when we are ready, when we have rested, when the morning comes and the story resumes. Sleep now. The river will be here when you wake. The morning does come, the story does resume, and the tragedy that has been waiting in the shadows finally steps into the light. It is March of 1847. The winter is loosening its grip on Vienna, and the days are beginning to lengthen, though the cold still hangs in the air of the hospital corridors, in the stone floors of the anatomy theatre, in the chill of the rooms where the cadavers lie waiting for the students who will learn from them. Semmelweis has been at his post for 8 months now, watching, counting, wondering. He has not yet found his answer. He has not yet made the connection that will change everything. But he is about to. Jakob Kolečka is a man of 43 years. He is a pathologist, a forensic doctor, a colleague of Semmelweis at the Vienna General Hospital. More than that, he is a friend. The two men have shared meals together, shared conversations, shared the peculiar camaraderie of physicians who work in close proximity to death, and somehow find ways to laugh, to hope, to imagine futures that extend beyond the next autopsy, the next patient, the next crisis. Kolečka is Czech by birth, Austrian by profession, a man respected by his students and valued by his peers. He has spent years teaching the art of dissection, guiding young hands through the intricate geography of the human body, demonstrating how to open a chest cavity, how to examine a liver, how to trace the course of an infection through tissue that no longer breathes. It is work that requires precision, patience, and a certain comfortable familiarity with mortality. Kolečka has all of these qualities. He is good at what he does. On this particular day in March, Kolečka is supervising a student during a post-mortem examination. The work is routine, the kind of thing he has done hundreds of times before. The cadaver lies on the table, and the student is practicing the careful incisions that will eventually become second nature. Perhaps the student is nervous. Perhaps his hand slips. Perhaps it is simply the kind of accident that happens in anatomy theatres, where sharp instruments and dead flesh meet in close quarters, and small mistakes are inevitable. Whatever the cause, the student's scalpel nicks Kolečka's finger. It is a tiny wound, barely worth mentioning. A drop of blood, a moment of irritation, and then the work continues. Kolečka wraps the cut with a bandage, perhaps makes a mild joke about the clumsiness of medical students, and returns to his teaching. Within days, he is ill. The symptoms come quickly and with terrible intensity. His abdomen swells and becomes tender. His breathing grows laboured as fluid accumulates around his lungs. His heart strains against the inflammation spreading through the tissues that surround it. His mind, that clear and capable mind that has guided so many students through so many lessons, begins to cloud as infection reaches his brain. The progression is swift and merciless. On the 13th of March, 1847, Jakob Kolečka dies. Semmelweis is devastated. The loss of a friend is always painful, but there is something about this particular death that lodges itself in his mind and will not let go. He attends the autopsy of his colleague, as physicians often do when they lose one of their own, and he watches as the body is opened and examined. What he sees there changes everything. Kolečka's abdomen is inflamed, the tissues swollen and discoloured by the infection that killed him. His lungs are surrounded by the telltale fluid of bilateral pleurisy. His heart sits encased in the inflammation of pericarditis. His peritoneum, the delicate membrane that lines the abdominal cavity, shows all the signs of peritonitis, and his brain, when the skull is opened, reveals the unmistakable marks of meningitis. These are the same inflammations. These are the same pathological changes. These are the same conditions that Semmelweis has seen over and over again in the bodies of the women who die in the first clinic. Kolečka, a man who had never been pregnant, who had never laboured to bring a child into the world, who had never set foot in the maternity ward as a patient, has died of an illness that is, in every anatomical detail, identical to childbed fever. The realisation strikes Semmelweis with the force of revelation. In his excited condition, he would later write, he could see clearly that the disease from which Kolečka died was identical to that from which so many hundred maternity patients had also died. The same symptoms, the same progression, the same pathological findings in the tissues. The only difference was the route of entry. For the mothers, the infection entered through the birth canal, through the internal wounds left by delivery, through the vulnerable tissues that physicians' hands touched during examinations. For Kolečka, the infection entered through a cut in his finger, through the tiny wound made by a contaminated scalpel. But the disease itself, the inexorable inflammatory cascade that killed them both, was the same. And suddenly, terribly, Semmelweis understands. The medical students go directly from dissecting cadavers to examining pregnant women. They carry something on their hands, some invisible substance, some particle of contamination from the dead flesh they have been handling. He will call it cadaverous particles, for lack of a better term, for lack of the vocabulary that germ theory will eventually provide. He does not know that these particles are bacteria. He does not understand the mechanism by which they cause disease. But he knows, with a certainty that will never waver, that the hands of physicians are carrying death from the autopsy room to the maternity ward. This is the moment of insight, and it is not a moment of pure joy. The elation of discovery is real, the scientist's thrill of having finally found the pattern that explains the data, but it comes wrapped in a weight that will press on Semmelweis for the rest of his life. Because if he is right, if cadaverous particles are the cause of childbed fever, then the physicians themselves are responsible. The young doctors, the eager students, the dedicated professors who believe they are saving lives are in fact killing their patients. Every examination performed with unwashed hands, every internal exam conducted after a morning spent in the anatomy theatre, has been an act of inadvertent murder. Hundreds of women, thousands of women, dead not because of bad air, not because of cosmic influences, not because of any mysterious miasma drifting through the wards, but because the men who came to help them came with death already on their fingers. The weight of this knowledge is almost unbearable. Semmelweis will carry it for years, will feel it pressing on him every time he looks at a colleague's hands, every time he remembers the women who died before he understood, every time he wonders how many of them he himself might have killed during his early days at the hospital, before the revelation, before the hand-washing, before he knew. The discovery that saves lives is also the discovery that assigns blame, and the blame falls on Semmelweis's profession, on his teachers, on his colleagues, on himself. But there is no time for grief, no time for self-recrimination, not when women are still dying. Semmelweis acts quickly. By May of 1847, just 2 months after Kolečka's death, he institutes a new policy in the first clinic. All physicians and medical students must wash their hands before examining any patient. But ordinary soap and water are not enough. Semmelweis has noticed that the smell of cadaver lingers on hands even after conventional washing, and he reasons that if the smell persists, so might the contamination. He needs something stronger, something that will eliminate not just the visible residue, but whatever invisible particles might be clinging to the skin. He chooses chlorinated lime, a solution of calcium hypochlorite, a chemical compound known for its ability to neutralize strong odors. The protocol is simple and absolute. Before each examination, every physician must wash his hands in the chlorinated lime solution. A nail brush is provided to scrub beneath the fingernails, where contamination might hide. The hands must be washed until they no longer carry the smell of the dead. The resistance begins immediately. The senior staff at the first clinic do not appreciate being told how to wash their hands. Many of them wear the residue of the anatomy theatre almost as a badge of honour, a sign of their dedication to the science of medicine, proof that they have been working hard among the cadavers. Grime and gore on a physician's hands are considered markers of diligence, evidence of long hours spent in the pursuit of medical knowledge. To be told that this residue is actually killing patients, that the signs of hard work are in fact signs of contamination, is not merely an inconvenience, it is an insult. It suggests that the physicians have been, all along, instruments of death rather than healing. It challenges their professional identity, their sense of themselves as men who help rather than harm. But Semmelweis has the authority to enforce his policy in the ward, and he uses it. For the first time, the hands that touch the women in the first clinic are truly clean, stripped of their invisible cargo of cadaverous particles, disinfected by the sharp chemical smell of chlorinated lime. The numbers begin to fall. In April of 1847, before the hand-washing protocol, the mortality rate in the first clinic stands at 18.3%. Nearly 1 woman in 5 who enters the ward to give birth will die there. In June, after the protocol has been in place for several weeks, the rate drops to 2.2%. In July, it falls further to 1.2%. In August, it rises slightly to 1.9%, still a fraction of what it was before. By 1848, the annual mortality rate in the first clinic has plummeted from 18% to less than 2%, matching and sometimes beating the rates in the second clinic, where the midwives have always worked with cleaner hands without ever knowing why it mattered. These are not abstract numbers. These are mothers who went home to their children. These are women who survived childbirth and lived to see their babies grow, to celebrate birthdays and holidays and ordinary afternoons, to grow old in ways they never would have if Semmelweis had not understood. Each percentage point represents dozens of lives. The difference between 18% mortality and 2% mortality in a ward that delivers thousands of babies each year is the difference between hundreds of coffins and hundreds of homecomings. Semmelweis has saved more lives in a few months than most physicians save in a career, simply by requiring his colleagues to wash their hands. He expects celebration. He expects gratitude. He expects the medical establishment to embrace his discovery with the same enthusiasm that he feels, to implement hand-washing protocols across Europe, to acknowledge that a simple intervention can prevent a terrible disease. He presents his findings to colleagues in Vienna. Ferdinand von Hebra, a supportive colleague, announces Semmelweis's discovery in the December 1847 and April 1848 issues of a prominent medical journal. The data are there for anyone to see. The mortality statistics speak for themselves. The connection between cadaverous particles and childbed fever seems, to Semmelweis at least, undeniable. Instead, he is met with silence, skepticism, and increasingly outright hostility. The resistance takes many forms, but beneath all of them lies a single uncomfortable truth. If Semmelweis is right, then the physicians are guilty. Not guilty of malice, not guilty of intentional harm, but guilty nonetheless. Every doctor who ever went from the anatomy theatre to the maternity ward, every professor who ever taught students to examine patients without washing first, every obstetrician who ever wondered why his patients died at higher rates than the midwife's patients, bears some responsibility for the deaths that followed. To accept Semmelweis's theory is to accept this guilt, and the medical establishment, like most establishments, is not inclined to accept guilt when other explanations are available. The alternative explanations multiply. Karl Braun, who will later succeed Semmelweis's Professor Johann Klein at the Vienna General Hospital, proposes no fewer than 30 different causes for childbed fever, including overcrowding, poor ventilation, the trauma of being examined by male physicians rather than female midwives, and something he calls cosmic telluric influences, a vague term suggesting that atmospheric or earthly conditions might somehow be responsible. Any explanation, it seems, is preferable to the one that implicates the physicians themselves. Across the Atlantic in Philadelphia, the American obstetrician Charles Delusina Meigs articulates the resistance with particular clarity. In his writings on childbed fever, Meigs dismisses the notion that a gentleman's hands could carry disease. Did he carry it on his hands? Meigs asks rhetorically. But a gentleman's hands are clean. The statement is extraordinary in its confidence and its blindness. Meigs is not disputing the mortality data. He is not questioning whether hand-washing reduces deaths. He is simply asserting that the hands of a physician, by virtue of belonging to a gentleman, cannot possibly be the agents of contamination. The social identity of the physician trumps the evidence of the ward. Gentlemen do not kill. Therefore physicians do not kill. Therefore the theory must be wrong. Semmelweis has no answer for this kind of argument because it is not really an argument at all. It is a statement of social faith, a declaration of professional identity, a refusal to consider evidence that threatens the self-image of the medical profession. How do you convince a man that his hands are dirty when he has built his entire sense of himself around the conviction that his hands are clean? There is also a deeper problem, one that lies at the level of theory rather than ego. Semmelweis knows that cadaverous particles cause childbed fever, but he cannot explain how. He does not understand the mechanism by which these invisible substances produce disease. The concept of germs has not yet been articulated. Louis Pasteur has not yet demonstrated that microorganisms cause fermentation. Robert Koch has not yet developed his postulates for proving that a specific bacterium causes a specific disease. Joseph Lister has not yet pioneered antiseptic surgery. The entire theoretical framework that will eventually explain why Semmelweis is right does not yet exist. Without that framework, Semmelweis is asking his colleagues to accept a theory that seems to violate the fundamental principles of medicine as they understand it. The miasma theory, for all its limitations, is at least a coherent system. It explains why disease clusters in certain places, why epidemics spread through cities, why some environments seem healthier than others. It offers physicians a way to understand their work that does not require them to believe in invisible particles that travel on hands. Semmelweis is proposing something that looks, to his contemporaries, almost like magic. Substances too small to see, carried on surfaces that appear clean, causing effects that cannot be directly observed. Without germ theory to anchor his claims, without a microscope to reveal the bacteria on unwashed hands, without the conceptual vocabulary to explain what cadaverous particles actually are, Semmelweis is fighting with one hand tied behind his back. And there are political complications as well. Semmelweis is Hungarian, working in Vienna at a time when nationalist tensions between Hungary and Austria are running high. The revolutions of 1848 will sweep across Europe, and in Hungary they will take the form of a bid for independence from the Austrian Empire. Semmelweis's nationality marks him, in the eyes of some Viennese colleagues, as an outsider, someone whose ideas might be dismissed not on their merits, but on the basis of where he comes from. It is easier to reject the theories of a foreigner than to accept guilt for the deaths of patients. The walls close in. In March of 1849, Semmelweis's term at the Vienna General Hospital expires, and he is obliged to leave the obstetrical clinic. The reasons are officially administrative, but the message is clear. His presence has become uncomfortable. His insistence on hand-washing, his refusal to let the matter drop, his implicit accusation against his colleagues, have made him unwelcome. He is offered a position that would allow him to continue his research, but the terms are insulting, limiting his work to mannequins rather than actual patients. He declines. The river flows on. The Danube moves through Vienna as it always has, carrying its waters eastward toward the Black Sea, indifferent to the struggles of physicians, indifferent to the discoveries made and rejected in the wards that line its banks. Semmelweis will eventually return to Hungary, to Budapest, where he will continue his work, continue his hand-washing protocols, continue to save lives in whatever institution will have him. But the victory he hoped for, the universal acceptance of his discovery, remains elusive. The deaths continue in the clinics that have not adopted his methods. The resistance continues among the physicians who cannot accept what his theory implies, and the women continue to die. Not in Semmelweis's ward, where the chlorinated lime solution stands ready, where the nail brushes wait beside the basin, where the protocol is enforced and the mortality rate remains low. But in other wards, in other cities, in other countries where the news has not yet arrived or has been heard and dismissed, the old practices continue. Students leave the anatomy theatre and enter the delivery room. Hands that have touched dead flesh touch living women. Cadaverous particles pass from corpse to patient to grave, and no one washes, and no one suspects, and no one changes. The tragedy is not that Semmelweis was ignored entirely. His findings were published, discussed, debated. Some physicians, persuaded by the evidence, adopted his methods and saw their mortality rates fall, but the majority held back. The majority found other explanations. The majority preferred to believe in bad air, in cosmic influences, in ventilation and overcrowding, and the trauma of male examination, rather than accept that their own hands had been killing their patients all along. This is the wall of denial. It is not built from stupidity or ignorance in any simple sense. The physicians who rejected Semmelweis were not fools. They were intelligent men, trained in the best medical schools of their era, working within a theoretical framework that had served medicine for centuries. They were defending not merely their egos, but their entire understanding of how disease works, how the world works, how their profession works. They were protecting themselves from a truth that would have required them to reimagine everything they thought they knew about their own hands, their own actions, their own daily work. And so the wall held. For nearly 2 more decades, until germ theory provided the explanation that Semmelweis could not give, until Pasteur and Koch and Lister built the scientific framework that made sense of cadaverous particles, until the invisible bacteria were finally seen and named and understood, the wall held. Semmelweis would spend those years fighting, publishing, pleading with his colleagues to wash their hands. He would grow increasingly frustrated, increasingly bitter, increasingly unable to understand why evidence that seemed so clear to him remained invisible to others. The fight would cost him his career, his peace of mind, and eventually his life. But that part of the story waits for another night. For now, rest with the knowledge that somewhere in Budapest, in the years after his departure from Vienna, Semmelweis is still saving lives. His wards have the lowest mortality rates in the region. His protocols work. His hands are clean, and the hands of everyone who works with him are clean, and the women who deliver their babies under his care go home to raise their children in numbers that would have seemed miraculous just a few years before. The evidence accumulates. The statistics grow more convincing with each passing year. And still the broader medical establishment resists. Still the miasma theory persists. Still the physicians of Europe and America examine their patients with hands that have not been washed. The river flows, the seasons turn, the babies are born, some in wards where hands are washed and some in wards where they are not. And the difference between these two kinds of wards is measured in coffins, in funerals, in children who grow up without mothers. Semmelweis knows this. He lives with this knowledge every day. He watches the numbers in his own ward and imagines the numbers in all the wards where his methods have been rejected. And he calculates the cost of denial in human lives. Settle deeper into your pillow now, let the rhythm of your breathing slow. The story has reached a painful place, a moment of insight that should have changed everything, but instead met the implacable resistance of a profession defending itself against an uncomfortable truth. Semmelweis has his revelation, he has his protocol, he has his falling numbers and his rising frustration. The fight is not over, it has barely begun, but the night is growing late, and the weight of the blankets is pressing you gently towards sleep, and there will be time enough in the chapters ahead to follow Semmelweis through his long struggle, through the letters that will burn bridges, through the isolation that will close around him, through the tragedy that awaits at the end of his road. For now, hold this knowledge gently, that a man once saw the truth about invisible contamination, that he tried to tell the world, that the world was not ready to listen, and that the women who died because of this refusal were not abstractions or statistics, but individual lives, each one precious, each one lost. The Danube flows through Vienna and Budapest and onward toward the sea. The chlorinated lime sits in its basin, waiting for hands that may or may not be washed. The century moves forward, carrying humanity toward discoveries that will vindicate Semmelweis long after it is too late to save him from the consequences of being right too soon. Sleep now. The river will be here when you wake. The story will continue, through resistance and heartbreak, through vindication and irony, through the strange journey that will eventually connect hand hygiene to advertising and advertising, to the dramas that played out over American radios while housewives listened and soap companies paid the bills. All of that is coming. But for now, the ward is quiet. The basin is full, and somewhere in the hospital, a physician is deciding whether or not to wash his hands. Rest. The centuries have brought us from the sacred waters of the Tiber through the unwashed ages of medieval Europe to this moment of painful clarity in 19th century Vienna. They will carry us further still through proof and tragedy and the slow acceptance that will eventually make hand hygiene one of the foundations of modern medicine. But that journey continues tomorrow. Tonight, let the gentle current of the past carry you into peaceful dreams, where the river still flows, where the truth still waits to be discovered, where somewhere a young doctor is still watching the wards and wondering why. The years pass. The Danube flows through Budapest, through Vienna, through all the cities where Semmelweis has worked and pleaded and demonstrated his findings, and the years pass and the deaths continue. Not in his ward, not under his direct supervision, not where his protocols are followed with religious devotion, but everywhere else, in maternity clinics across the continent, in the great teaching hospitals of Paris and London and Edinburgh, in the small provincial hospitals where young physicians fresh from their training carry the habits they learned from their teachers, the deaths continue. Semmelweis knows this. He calculates this. He lies awake at night imagining the faces of women he has never met, women who are dying at this very moment because a physician has just examined them with hands still carrying the invisible particles of a dissection performed an hour ago, and he feels the weight of this knowledge pressing down on him like a physical burden, like something he cannot set aside, like something that is slowly crushing him. In Budapest, where he now works, his methods continue to save lives. The numbers remain low. The women who deliver their babies in his care go home to their families. The chlorinated lime sits in its basin, and the hands that touch his patients are clean, and the proof of his theory accumulates with every successful delivery, every mother who survives, every child who will know her face. But the proof that should convince the world convinces almost no one. The letters he receives from colleagues are polite at best, dismissive more often, openly hostile at worst. The medical journals that might have championed his cause remain skeptical. The professors who train the next generation of physicians do not teach his methods, and so the deaths continue, not in his ward but in all the others, and Semmelweis watches and calculates and feels the injustice of it, settling into his bones like a slow poison. He begins to write. At first, the letters are measured, professional, the careful communications of a physician trying to share important findings with his peers. He addresses his colleagues with respect, presents his evidence methodically, appeals to their commitment to healing and their responsibility to their patients. He believes, in these early years of his letter-writing campaign, that the truth will eventually prevail, that the evidence is simply too strong to be ignored forever, that sooner or later the profession will accept what he has demonstrated and change its practices accordingly. He is still hopeful, still patient, still confident that reason will triumph over inertia. But the responses he receives are not what he hopes for. Some colleagues ignore him entirely. Others respond with condescension, explaining that his findings, while interesting, do not align with established medical theory and therefore cannot be taken seriously. Still, others suggest that perhaps the low mortality rates in his ward are due to some other factor, some local condition in Budapest, some peculiarity of his patient population, anything except the hand-washing protocol that he has implemented with such care. They propose cosmic influences and atmospheric disturbances in the emotional states of the mothers and the positions of the stars, anything to avoid confronting the implication that their own unwashed hands might be killing their patients. As the years pass and the resistance continues and the deaths accumulate, something begins to change in Semmelweis. The measured tone of his early letters gives way to something sharper, something more desperate. He has seen too many women die. He has imagined too many children growing up without mothers. He has calculated too many preventable deaths, has lain awake through too many nights with the weight of this knowledge pressing down on him, and the patience that once characterized his advocacy begins to erode. The letters grow longer, the arguments grow more intense. The frustration that he has held in check for so many years begins to leak through the careful professional language, staining his prose with bitterness and rage. In 1861, after more than a decade of advocacy and rejection, Semmelweis publishes his masterwork. The book is called The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, and it represents his attempt to present all of his evidence, all of his arguments, all of his accumulated knowledge in a single comprehensive volume that might finally convince the medical profession to change its ways. He pours everything into this book. He gathers his statistics from years of careful observation. He presents his theory of cadaverous contamination with all the clarity he can muster. He explains the mechanism by which invisible particles are transferred from corpses to patients, from dissection tables to delivery rooms, from the hands of physicians to the bodies of vulnerable women. He documents the dramatic decline in mortality that followed the implementation of his chlorinated lime protocol. He presents case after case, number after number, life after life that has been saved by the simple practice of washing hands. But the book is not what it should have been. The years of struggle have left their mark on Semmelweis, and the mark is visible on every page. The arguments that should flow with logical precision become tangled in repetition and anger. The evidence that should speak for itself is buried under waves of bitterness and recrimination. The professional tone that might have persuaded skeptical colleagues is shattered again and again by outbursts of rage against the physicians who have rejected his findings, the professors who continue to teach their students that hand washing is unnecessary, the entire medical establishment that has closed ranks against the truth. The book is brilliant and tragic in equal measure, a masterwork of observation undermined by the very passion that drove its creation. The scientific evidence is there, irrefutable, demonstrated by years of careful documentation, but the presentation is so wrapped in fury, so interrupted by attacks on his critics, so marred by the visible wounds of a man who has spent too long fighting a battle he should not have had to fight, that the evidence becomes easy to dismiss. His enemies do not have to engage with his data. They can simply point to his tone and declare him unreasonable, and the letters continue. After the book fails to convince, after the masterwork is met with the same indifference and hostility that greeted all his earlier efforts, Semmelweis does not retreat into silence. Instead, he pushes harder. The letters he writes to prominent European obstetricians become longer, more frequent, more desperate. He addresses them not as colleagues but as opponents, not as physicians who might be persuaded but as murderers who must be confronted. The word appears in his letters, that terrible word that no physician wants to hear applied to himself: murderer. Semmelweis uses it deliberately, repeatedly, with full knowledge of how it will be received. He writes that every physician who examines a patient with unwashed hands is committing murder. He writes that every professor who fails to teach his students to wash their hands is training a generation of murderers. He writes that the medical profession has become a conspiracy of silence protecting the guilty, that the deaths of thousands upon thousands of women lie on the conscience of doctors who know better but refuse to act, that the blood of these women cries out for justice against those who could have saved them and chose not to. It weighs on my conscience, he writes in one of these letters, that thousands upon thousands of mothers and infants have perished, lives that could have been saved. The words burn on the page. They are meant to burn. Semmelweis is no longer trying to persuade with gentle reason. He has tried that approach for more than a decade and it has failed. Now he is trying to shame, to accuse, to make it impossible for his colleagues to ignore the truth by forcing them to confront the moral implications of their denial. He calls their inaction a massacre. He calculates the number of preventable deaths and presents the calculation as an indictment. He wants them to feel the weight he feels, to lie awake at night as he lies awake, to understand that their comfortable denial is not merely a scientific disagreement, but an ongoing catastrophe measured in human lives. One letter runs to 64 pages. It is addressed to a professor named Scanzoni, an obstetrician in Prague who has mildly questioned some of Semmelweis's findings. A mild question, a professional disagreement of the sort that happens in every scientific field, and Semmelweis responds with 64 pages of furious attack. He dissects every point Scanzoni has raised. He refutes every objection with overwhelming evidence. He accuses Scanzoni of willful ignorance, of intellectual dishonesty, of responsibility for the deaths of women who might have been saved if only Scanzoni had listened, had accepted the truth, had implemented the protocols that have proven so effective in Semmelweis's own ward. 64 pages of concentrated rage, of accumulated frustration, of a brilliant mind that has been worn down by years of fighting an unwinnable battle. The medical establishment responds exactly as one might expect. They do not engage with the evidence. They do not address the statistics that demonstrate the effectiveness of hand washing. They do not explain why the mortality rates in Semmelweis's ward are so dramatically lower than the rates in wards where his methods have been rejected. Instead, they point to the letters themselves, to the intemperate language, to the accusations of murder, to the 64-page attacks on colleagues who have merely expressed professional skepticism. They say that Semmelweis has lost his reason. They say that no rational physician would write such letters. They say that the man who claims to have discovered the cause of childbed fever is clearly unbalanced, clearly driven by personal animosity rather than scientific inquiry, clearly not to be taken seriously. The letters that were meant to force a reckoning become instead the pretext for dismissal. The behaviour born of injustice becomes the excuse to ignore the truth, and still the years pass, and still the deaths continue, and still Semmelweis calculates and corresponds and pleads and accuses, his mental state deteriorating as the weight of his failure bears down on him, as the knowledge of preventable deaths accumulates like a debt he cannot pay. He suffers bouts of severe depression. The brilliance that once characterised his thinking becomes intermittent, interrupted by periods of darkness and confusion. His colleagues notice the change. His family notices the change. The man who once presented his findings with careful logic now repeats himself compulsively, returning again and again to the same arguments, the same statistics, the same accusations, as if repetition might finally accomplish what reason could not. By 1865, the deterioration has become impossible to ignore. Some historians suggest that Semmelweis may have been suffering from dementia, perhaps caused by advanced syphilis, a common enough affliction in that era. Others point to the accumulated trauma of his years of struggle, the psychological toll of watching preventable deaths and being unable to stop them, the slow corrosion of a mind that has carried an unbearable burden for too long. Whatever the cause, the brilliant physician who once revolutionized the practice of obstetrics has become someone his friends and colleagues no longer fully recognize. His behavior grows erratic, his moods swing between rage and despair. The letters that once targeted his professional critics now seem to target everyone around him. The man is breaking, and those who know him can see it happening, can watch the cracks spreading through a psyche that has been under too much pressure for too many years. On July 30th, 1865, Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra visits Semmelweis. Hebra is an old friend, one of the few who has consistently supported Semmelweis throughout his long struggle. He was one of the first to publish Semmelweis's findings back in 1847, when the chlorinated lime protocol was still new and the evidence was just beginning to accumulate. He has watched his friend's decline with concern and sorrow. Now he has come with a proposal. There is a new institute, he tells Semmelweis, a place where interesting work is being done. Would Semmelweis like to visit it? Semmelweis agrees. Perhaps he is hoping for a new beginning, a fresh start in a place where his ideas might finally be accepted. Perhaps he's simply tired, willing to go wherever his old friend suggests. He accompanies Hebra through the streets of Vienna, through the familiar city where so much of his career has unfolded, toward what he believes will be an ordinary professional visit. But the destination is not an institute. The building that Hebra leads him to is the Landesirrenanstalt Döbling, the provincial lunatic asylum on Lazarettgasse. Semmelweis realizes too late what is happening. He tries to leave. He protests that there has been a misunderstanding, that he does not belong in such a place, that he is a physician of good standing with important work still to do. But the decision has already been made. His family has agreed to his commitment. His colleagues have concluded that his behaviour has become too erratic to ignore. The man who discovered the importance of clean hands is now considered too unbalanced to be trusted in polite society. What happens next is recorded in fragments, pieced together from asylum records and later investigations. Semmelweis resists. Of course he resists. He is being confined against his will in a place for the insane when he knows with absolute certainty that he is not insane, that his only crime has been seeing the truth too clearly and speaking it too loudly. He struggles with the guards who are trying to restrain him. The struggle becomes violent. By the time it ends, Semmelweis has been beaten severely, secured in a straitjacket and confined to a darkened cell. The treatments at the asylum are standard for the era, which is to say they are brutal by any humane standard. The patients are doused with cold water to calm their agitation. They are given castor oil, a harsh laxative, as if their mental disturbances might be purged through their bowels. They are kept in darkness and isolation, denied the stimulation that might help them recover, subjected to a regime designed more for the convenience of the staff than for the healing of the patients. Semmelweis endures all of this for 2 weeks, 14 days in the darkness, 14 days of cold water and castor oil, and the aftermath of his beating. 14 days during which the wound on his right hand, sustained during the struggle with the guards, begins to fester and spread. The infection starts in the middle finger of his right hand. Perhaps the wound was already contaminated when it was inflicted, carrying bacteria from the hands of the guards or the floor of the asylum. Perhaps the injury became infected afterward, in the unsanitary conditions of the cell where Semmelweis was confined. Either way, the contamination takes hold. The finger swells. The flesh begins to blacken. The infection spreads from the finger to the hand, from the hand to the arm, from the arm into the bloodstream. Gangrenous osteomyelitis, the doctors will call it later. The bone itself is dying, rotting inside the living flesh, and from the dying tissue, bacteria pour into the blood, seeding new infections throughout his body. An abscess forms in his left thorax, growing until it is the size of a man's fist. His temperature spikes. His organs begin to fail. On August 13th, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis dies. He is 47 years old. The official cause of death is pemia, blood poisoning, the same type of systemic infection that he had spent his entire career trying to prevent. He dies of the very thing he had discovered how to stop. He dies in an asylum, far from the maternity wards where his protocols saved countless lives. He dies abandoned by a profession that refused to listen to him, confined to a cell by colleagues who found his passion for the truth more disturbing than the deaths he was trying to prevent. He dies 2 weeks after being lured into an asylum and beaten by guards. He dies with an infection raging through his body, an infection caused by an unclean wound, an infection that would have been entirely preventable if only someone had washed their hands. 2 days later, on August 15th, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis is buried in Vienna. The funeral is small. The medical establishment that rejected him does not mourn him. The newspapers do not mark the passing of one of the most important physicians of the century. He goes into the ground quietly, a failed prophet, a broken man, a cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much about the truth. But even as Semmelweis is being lowered into his grave, the world he died trying to save is beginning to change. Just weeks before his death, in the city of Glasgow, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister has begun publishing his findings on antiseptic surgery. Lister has been following the work of a French chemist named Louis Pasteur, who's been conducting experiments with fermentation and putrefaction, experiments that are leading him toward a revolutionary understanding of disease. Pasteur is discovering that the invisible contamination Semmelweis intuited is real, that it consists of living microorganisms, that these tiny creatures are responsible for infection and decay, and the mysterious transmission of disease from one person to another. The germ theory of disease, the framework that Semmelweis never had, the scientific foundation that might have made his arguments unanswerable, is beginning to emerge from laboratories in France and operating theatres in Scotland. Lister is already washing his hands with carbolic acid. He's already demonstrating that surgical wounds treated with antiseptic methods heal better and faster and with fewer infections than wounds treated in the traditional manner. He's already beginning the process of vindication that will eventually make Semmelweis a hero, and his detractors a cautionary tale about the dangers of professional arrogance. But the vindication comes too late. Semmelweis is already dead, buried in Vienna with an infection in his blood, an abscess in his chest, and the weight of thousands of preventable deaths on his conscience. The truth he discovered is about to be proven beyond any possible doubt, and he will not live to see it. The medical establishment that rejected him is about to embrace the very principles he fought for, and they will do so without ever acknowledging how much they owe to the man they dismissed as a lunatic. There is a word for this kind of tragedy, or perhaps there should be. The prophet who sees the truth and speaks the truth, and is destroyed for speaking the truth, only to be vindicated after his death when the truth he spoke becomes impossible to deny. Semmelweis joins a long line of such figures, men and women who paid with their lives or their sanity for the crime of being right too soon, of understanding something that their contemporaries were not ready to understand, of caring too deeply about a truth that the world was not ready to hear. The injustice of his death is not just medical or scientific, it is deeply, tragically human. A man who wanted only to save lives was destroyed by the very profession that should have celebrated him, broken not by ignorance, but by the willful refusal to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Danube flows on. The maternity wards continue their work, some with clean hands and some without. The women continue to give birth, some to go home and raise their children, and some to die of infections that should have been preventable. The chlorinated lime sits in its basin, waiting for hands that may or may not be washed. And in a grave in Vienna, a man lies who knew the answer, who tried to tell the world, who was right about everything and wrong only about the willingness of powerful men to admit their mistakes. Sleep settles more deeply now. The rhythm of your breathing has slowed, your heartbeat calm and steady beneath the weight of the blankets. The story has reached its darkest hour, the moment when the prophet is silenced and the truth seems to have died with him. But the night will not last forever. The morning is coming, bringing with it the discoveries that will prove Semmelweis right, the germ theory that will explain what he could only observe, the revolution in medical practice that will eventually make hand hygiene one of the foundations of modern medicine. Pasteur is working in his laboratory, Lister is operating in his theatre. The world is changing, even if it cannot feel the change yet, even if the vindication that is coming will arrive too late to save the man who deserved it most. Rest now. Let the weight of this tragedy settle over you like a gentle blanket. The story will continue, carrying us from vindication through soap and advertising, and the strange cultural forces that will transform hand hygiene from a medical revolution into a consumer anxiety, from a matter of life and death into a marketing opportunity. But that journey waits for another time. For now, hold gently the memory of a man who saw the truth and paid the ultimate price for speaking it, who died of the very infection he had learned how to prevent, who lies now in the earth of Vienna while the world slowly begins to understand what he already knew. The river flows, the seasons turn, the centuries move forward, carrying humanity toward understanding. Somewhere in a laboratory, a scientist is peering into a microscope, beginning to see the invisible creatures that Semmelweis could only imagine. Somewhere in an operating theatre, a surgeon is washing his hands with carbolic acid, unknowingly fulfilling the protocols that Semmelweis championed. The vindication is coming. It is just too late. And that perhaps is the most human tragedy of all. To be right, to know you are right, to die for being right, and to miss by mere months the proof that would have saved you. The proof arrived in silence, the way dawn arrives after a long and bitter night. Not with trumpets, not with apologies, not with any acknowledgement that a man had been broken and buried while the truth he carried was still warm in his grave. It arrived in laboratories, in quiet observations, in the patient accumulation of evidence that would eventually make the invisible visible and the unthinkable undeniable. In Paris, a chemist named Louis Pasteur was working with fermentation, with wine and beer, and the mysterious processes that turned sugar into alcohol or spoiled it into vinegar. He was not thinking about maternity wards or childbed fever or a Hungarian physician who had died in an asylum. He was thinking about yeast, about the tiny organisms he could see under his microscope, about the way these invisible creatures seemed to be responsible for processes that had been attributed to spontaneous generation or to vague chemical reactions. Throughout the 1860s and into the 1870s, Pasteur demonstrated again and again that specific microorganisms cause specific outcomes. Fermentation was not a mysterious chemical process, but the work of a living creature too small to see with the naked eye. Spoilage was not the inevitable decay of matter, but the activity of particular organisms that could be controlled, killed, or excluded. The implications spread outward like ripples in still water. If tiny organisms caused fermentation, if they caused spoilage, if they could be identified and controlled, then perhaps they also caused disease. Perhaps the corruption of wounds, the putrefaction of flesh, the mysterious fevers that killed patients after surgery were not the result of bad air or constitutional weakness, or divine punishment, but the work of specific creatures that entered the body and multiplied there. Perhaps Semmelweis's cadaverous particles were not particles at all, but living things, organisms with their own life cycles and their own vulnerabilities. In Germany, a country doctor named Robert Koch was approaching the same questions from a different direction. In 1876, he published his description of the life cycle of the anthrax bacillus, showing how the organism caused the disease, how it reproduced, how it formed spores that could survive in the soil for years. This was not speculation or theory. This was observation, demonstration, proof. Koch could show you the organism. He could grow it in culture, inject it into animals, watch them sicken and die, recover the same organism from their bodies. In 1882, he identified the bacterium that caused tuberculosis, the great killer that had claimed countless lives across centuries. In 1884, he found the organism responsible for cholera. Each discovery was another brick in the wall, another piece of evidence that disease was not mysterious or random, but the result of specific causes that could be understood, prevented, and eventually defeated. The cadaverous particles that Semmelweis had described, the invisible something that physicians carried on their hands from the autopsy room to the maternity ward, now had names and shapes and life cycles. They were bacteria. They were Streptococcus pyogenes and its relatives, organisms that thrived in dead tissue and living flesh alike, that could be transferred from corpse to patient on unwashed hands, that multiplied in the warm environment of the uterus and spread through the bloodstream, causing the fever, the infection, the agonizing death that Semmelweis had spent his career trying to prevent. In Scotland, a surgeon named Joseph Lister was paying close attention to Pasteur's work. Lister operated in an era when surgery was still a desperate last resort, when patients who survived the knife often died of infection in the days that followed, when the wards stank of putrefaction, and the death rate from compound fractures could reach 40% or higher. He read Pasteur's papers on fermentation and decomposition, and he began to wonder whether the same principles might apply to wounds. If putrefaction was caused by organisms in the air, organisms that could be controlled or excluded, then perhaps surgical infections could be prevented by keeping those organisms away from the patient. In the 1860s, Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid, the same phenol that was used to treat sewage and control odours. He soaked bandages in it, sprayed it into the air of his operating theatre, used it to clean his hands and his instruments before surgery. The results were remarkable. Mortality from compound fractures plummeted. Wounds that would have festered and killed instead healed cleanly. Patients who would have died of sepsis went home to their families. Lister's antiseptic method was a direct descendant of Semmelweis's hand-washing, built on the same insight that invisible contamination could be controlled by chemical intervention. But Lister had something that Semmelweis had never possessed: the theoretical framework to explain why the method worked. He could point to Pasteur's experiments, to Koch's bacteria, to the emerging science of microbiology, and say that he was excluding specific organisms with specific properties from wounds where they would otherwise multiply and kill. He was not asking his colleagues to accept a mystery. He was showing them a mechanism. The medical world began, slowly and reluctantly, to change. The glacial pace of adoption would have been heartbreaking to Semmelweis had he lived to see it. Even in the late 1870s, more than a decade after his death, blood-stained frock coats were considered suitable operating room attire. Surgeons wore the same clothes to operate that they wore to see patients on the ward, the same clothes they had worn to perform autopsies, the accumulated grime of their profession visible on their sleeves as a mark of experience and authority. As late as the 1890s, surgeons operated without masks, without head coverings, without gloves, their bare hands and uncovered faces exposed to the wounds they were trying to heal. But the change was coming. Year by year, hospital by hospital, the evidence accumulated until denial became impossible. Hand hygiene moved from eccentricity to standard practice. Antiseptic technique became the norm rather than the exception. The death rates that had haunted maternity wards and surgical theatres for centuries began to fall, and they kept falling as each generation of physicians learned what the previous generation had refused to believe. And Semmelweis was rehabilitated. The man who had been dismissed as a troublemaker, whose ideas had been rejected by the medical establishment of his time, whose final years had been consumed by bitterness and mental collapse, was gradually transformed into a hero of medicine. Statues were erected to his memory, hospitals were named for him. His face appeared on postage stamps, his story was taught in medical schools, his chlorinated lime solution was recognized as the foundation of modern infection control. But the vindication arrived too late. It arrived too late to save him, too late to restore his career or his sanity, too late to give him the recognition he deserved while he was alive to appreciate it. And it arrived too late to save the hundreds of thousands of women who died of childbed fever in the decades between his dismissal from Vienna and the world's acceptance of germ theory. Each of those deaths was preventable. Each of those women could have gone home to raise her children if the physicians attending her had simply washed their hands. The gap between Semmelweis's understanding and the world's acceptance was measured not just in years but in lives. an uncountable toll of mothers and wives and daughters who died because powerful men could not admit that they had been wrong. The bitterness of this vindication cannot be overstated. To be proven right after death is not the same as being believed in life. The statues and the hospital names and the postage stamps are memorials, not justice. They acknowledge that Semmelweis was correct, but they cannot restore what his correctness cost him. He died in an asylum, beaten by guards, killed by the very infection he had learned to prevent. The triumph of germ theory is his triumph, but he never lived to share in it. The river flows, the seasons turn, the women continue to give birth, but now their chances of survival are transformed by knowledge that came too late for the man who discovered it. Rest with this bittersweet truth for a moment. Hold gently the weight of vindication that arrived after death, of recognition that could not restore what had been lost. The story is not finished. The journey from medical necessity to consumer product is only beginning, and the path it will take leads through territory stranger and more cynical than anything Semmelweis could have imagined. By the late 19th century, germ theory had escaped the laboratory and entered the public consciousness. People who had never looked through a microscope, who could not have identified a bacterium if their lives depended on it, understood that invisible creatures caused disease and that cleanliness could control them. The revolution in understanding that Pasteur and Koch had sparked was filtering down from physicians and scientists to ordinary people, transforming the way they thought about their bodies, their homes, their daily habits. And where there is fear, there is opportunity. Where there is a newly anxious public, there are entrepreneurs ready to sell them relief from that anxiety. The soap manufacturers saw what was coming before almost anyone else. In 1879, Procter & Gamble launched Ivory soap with two claims that would define its marketing for generations. It floated, and it was 99 and 44/100% pure. The floating was a happy accident, the result of air being whipped into the soap mixture, but it became a selling point because it suggested lightness, buoyancy, a kind of ethereal cleanliness that ordinary soap could not match. The purity claim was more calculated, a precise-sounding number that suggested scientific measurement and laboratory standards, that positioned the soap not just as a cleaning product, but as a guarantee of safety in an age newly terrified of invisible contamination. In 1894, Lever Brothers launched Lifebuoy in the United Kingdom as the Royal Disinfectant Soap. This was no gentle beauty bar. Lifebuoy was built around hygiene and germ protection, its reddish colour and strong medicinal smell coming from the carbolic formula that Joseph Lister had used to revolutionise surgery. The phenol that Lister had sprayed into his operating theatre was now available in a bar of soap that ordinary families could use in their bathrooms. The marketing made the connection explicit. This was not merely soap, but protection. Not merely cleanliness, but safety. The power of antisepsis brought down from the surgical theatre to the kitchen sink. The soap companies understood something that the medical establishment had been slow to learn. Fear is a powerful motivator. The same terror of invisible contamination that had driven the acceptance of germ theory could be harnessed to sell products. If people were afraid of germs, they would buy soap. If they were afraid enough, they would buy a lot of soap. And if new fears could be created, new sources of anxiety identified, new social catastrophes invented, they would buy even more. The shift was profound and largely invisible. Hygiene moved from a medical necessity argued by martyred doctors to a consumer product sold through shame, aspiration, and fear of social rejection. The same insight that had cost Semmelweis his career and his life was now being packaged and marketed by advertising agencies, turned into slogans and campaigns designed to make people feel dirty, inadequate, and socially vulnerable unless they purchased the right products. The dismal days of the 1930s depression proved to be fertile ground for this kind of marketing. While Eau de Roneau, a deodorant for women, had coined the phrase BO in 1919, it was Lifebuoy that popularised the saying and made it their own, body odour. Two simple letters that carried an enormous weight of social anxiety, of fear that you might be offensive to others without knowing it, that your friends and colleagues might be whispering about you behind your back, that your career or your marriage might be suffering because of something you could not smell yourself, but everyone around you could. Lever Brothers began their BO body odour sales pitch in the Depression, and Lifebuoy's sales quadrupled. Daily use of the soap promised success, friends and romance. The The advertising did not merely suggest that clean people were more pleasant to be around, it suggested that unwashed people were pariahs, outcasts, failures in every dimension of life. The soap was not a luxury but a necessity, and the necessity was social rather than medical. You might not get sick from body odour, but you might lose your job, your spouse, your standing in the community. The fear was manufactured, but the products that relieved it were very real and very profitable. The hygiene anxiety machine had been invented, and it would only grow more sophisticated in the years to come. In the 1920s, the Lambert Pharmaceutical Company faced a problem. They owned a product called Listerine, a surgical antiseptic that had been created in the 1880s by Dr. Joseph Lawrence, and named after the pioneer of antiseptic surgery, Joseph Lister himself. The formula had been purchased by Jordan Wheat Lambert, and for decades it had been marketed to physicians and hospitals as a clinical product. But the market for surgical antiseptics was limited, and the Lamberts wanted to expand. Jordan Wheat Lambert's son found the solution in a word. He combined the Latin term for breath, halitus, with the medical ending osis, and created halitosis. The word sounded clinical, scientific, like a diagnosis that a physician might give. It had the gravity of a medical condition, the authority of Latin, the suggestion that this was not merely unpleasant breath, but a pathological state requiring treatment, and it could be treated conveniently enough with Listerine. The advertising campaign that followed was a masterpiece of manufactured anxiety. Listerine ran advertisements in newspapers and magazines featuring emotionally compelling narratives of social failure and romantic disappointment. The most famous of these featured Edna, a woman who watched her friends getting married while she remained single year after year, always the bridesmaid and never the bride. The advertisements did not say directly that Edna had bad breath. They suggested it, implied it, let the reader draw the inevitable conclusion. And they offered the solution, Listerine, the cure for the condition that was keeping Edna from happiness. The results were extraordinary. Listerine skyrocketed from modest annual sales of about $100,000 in 1921 to a whopping $4 million by 1927. By the late 1920s, Listerine stood as America's third highest print advertiser. Marketing historians refer to this campaign as the halitosis appeal, shorthand for using fear to sell products. The mechanism was elegant in its cynicism. First, identify or invent a condition that people might have without knowing it. Second, suggest that this condition has devastating social consequences that the sufferer cannot see, but everyone around them can. Third, offer a product that cures the condition. The fear was often disproportionate to any real threat, the condition often exaggerated or entirely invented, but the anxiety was real and the sales followed. Advertisements for Listerine transformed halitosis from a bothersome personal imperfection into an embarrassing medical condition that urgently required treatment. The word itself did the heavy lifting. People who had never worried about their breath before now wondered if they might be suffering from halitosis without knowing it. The uncertainty was the point. You could not be sure you were safe, and the only way to protect yourself was to use the product. The copywriters had discovered something profound about human psychology. People are more motivated by the fear of loss than by the hope of gain. They are more afraid of being rejected than they are hopeful of being accepted, and they are terrified of social failure, of being judged and found wanting by the people around them. The hygiene anxiety machine exploited these fears with precision and skill, creating problems that could only be solved by purchasing the right products. The same techniques were applied to an expanding array of conditions. Infectious dandruff became a threat to social standing. Pink toothbrush, the appearance of blood on the bristles after brushing, was reframed from a minor inconvenience into a sign of impending tooth loss and social catastrophe. Each condition was described in terms that made it seem both common and devastating, easily overlooked by the sufferer but obvious to everyone else. A hidden flaw that was ruining lives and relationships while the victim remained blissfully unaware. The advertising agencies employed the best minds they could find. Copywriters who studied consumer psychology and focus groups, who tested different appeals and measured their effectiveness, who refined their techniques with the precision of scientists conducting experiments. They were not trying to deceive people about the properties of their products. They were trying to change the way people felt about themselves, to create new anxieties, and then offer relief from those anxieties in exchange for money. The brilliance of the strategy is undeniable. The Listerine campaign alone generated returns that would be remarkable in any era, turning a niche surgical product into a household necessity. The techniques pioneered in these campaigns became the foundation of modern advertising, the template that would be used to sell everything from toothpaste to automobiles to political candidates. Fear works, shame sells, anxiety creates demand. But the cynicism at the core of these campaigns is equally undeniable. The advertisers were not solving problems that already existed. They were creating problems that could only be solved by their products. They were manufacturing the very anxieties they claimed to relieve, deliberately making people feel inadequate and insecure so that they would purchase the cure. The gap between Semmelweis, who begged physicians to wash their hands to prevent women from dying, and the advertising executives who invented halitosis to sell mouthwash is vast and troubling. Both were concerned with hygiene, but their motivations could not have been more different. Semmelweis wanted to save lives. He spent his career trying to convince physicians to adopt a practice that would prevent needless deaths, and he was destroyed for his efforts. The advertising executives wanted to make money. They spent their careers trying to convince consumers to feel anxious about conditions that were often trivial or invented, and they were celebrated for their success. The same impulse toward cleanliness that had cost a man his sanity and his life was now being weaponized by corporations to sell soap and mouthwash. The public that emerged from these campaigns was cleaner, certainly. The fear of germs and the shame of body odor and the anxiety about halitosis drove people to wash more frequently, to use more products, to maintain standards of hygiene that would have seemed excessive to earlier generations. But the cleanliness came with a psychological cost. People were no longer washing because it was pleasant or healthy. They were washing because they were afraid, because they had been taught to see their own bodies as sources of contamination and social failure, because the advertising had convinced them that they were always one missed shower away from rejection and loneliness. The transformation was complete by the middle of the 20th century. Hygiene had moved from a medical revolution to a consumer anxiety, from a matter of life and death argued by martyred physicians to a marketing opportunity exploited by advertising agencies. The hands that Semmelweis had begged physicians to wash were now being washed compulsively by millions of ordinary people, not to prevent infection, but to prevent social embarrassment, not because they understood germ theory, but because they feared the judgment of their neighbours. Rest now with this strange irony. The insight that cost Semmelweis everything, the understanding that clean hands could save lives, had been absorbed into the culture so completely that it was no longer about saving lives at all. It had become about selling products, about creating and relieving anxieties, about the endless cycle of fear and purchase that would define consumer culture for generations to come. The river of commerce flows ever onward. The soap companies grow wealthy on manufactured shame. The advertising agencies refine their techniques with each new campaign, learning better and better how to make people feel inadequate and how to offer them relief for a price. The medical revolution that vindicated Semmelweis has been transformed into something he would barely recognize, a vast machine for producing and monetizing hygiene anxiety. And yet, beneath all the advertising and the manufactured fears, the fundamental truth remains. Washing hands prevents disease. Clean water and soap can save lives. The insight that Semmelweis died for is still valid, still important, still one of the foundations of public health. The cynicism of the advertising cannot erase the reality of germ theory. The manufactured anxieties about body odor and halitosis are layered on top of genuine knowledge about how disease spreads and how it can be prevented. The story has one more turn to take, one more strange transformation to undergo. The soap companies that grew wealthy on hygiene anxiety would find another use for their profits, another way to reach into the homes of American families and shape their daily lives. They would sponsor radio programs, dramas and serials and entertainment that would carry their advertising directly into living rooms across the country. And those programs, funded by soap money and interrupted by soap commercials, would come to be known by a name that captured their origins perfectly. But that part of the journey waits for another time. For now, let the weight of this strange transformation settle over you. From Roman aqueducts to medieval filth, from Semmelweis's chlorinated lime to Lister's carbolic acid, from Pasteur's microscope to the advertising agencies of Madison Avenue, the story of hand hygiene has wound through centuries and continents, through tragedy and triumph and cynical exploitation. The same impulse that drove a Hungarian physician to beg his colleagues to wash their hands now drives consumers to purchase products they may not need to relieve anxieties they were taught to feel. The soap sits in its dish. The water runs warm, the hands are washed and washed again for reasons that have multiplied and transformed beyond anything Semmelweis could have imagined. Sleep now, and let the story carry you gently forward toward its conclusion. The radio crackled to life in kitchens across America. It was the early 1930s, the depths of the Great Depression, and for millions of families the radio had become the center of the home, a window into a larger world, a source of news and music and escape from the grinding anxieties of unemployment and poverty. The technology was still relatively new, still magical in a way that later generations would find difficult to understand. Voices travelled invisibly through the air and emerged from wooden cabinets in living rooms and kitchens, bringing the outside world directly into the most intimate spaces of domestic life. The advertisers noticed. Of course they noticed. The same companies that had learned to manufacture hygiene anxiety through print advertising now saw an opportunity to reach consumers in an entirely new way. Radio was immediate, personal, intimate. A voice speaking directly into the home carried a different kind of authority than words printed on a page, and radio was cheap, especially during the daytime hours when the networks struggled to fill their schedules and the advertising rates dropped to levels that even modest companies could afford. The daytime audience was predominantly female. Housewives at home during the working hours, tending to children and cooking and cleaning, often had the radio playing in the background as a companion during their daily routines. The soap companies recognized this audience immediately. These were the very consumers they had spent decades cultivating through print advertising, the women who purchased household products and made decisions about which brands to trust. Here was a way to reach them directly, to speak to them while they worked, to keep the company name and the company products constantly present in their minds. Procter & Gamble saw the opportunity more clearly than most. The company that had built its fortune on Ivory soap, the soap that floated, the soap that was 99 and 44/100% pure, now turned its attention to a laundry product called Oxydol. Oxydol was a soap powder, a product for washing clothes rather than washing bodies, but it occupied the same psychological territory. Clean clothes, like clean hands and fresh breath, had become a marker of social respectability, and the same anxieties that drove the purchase of personal hygiene products could be extended to household cleaning. The question was how to use the radio effectively. Simple advertisements, the kind that interrupted musical programs to announce product benefits, worked well enough. But Procter & Gamble wanted something more, something that would keep listeners tuned in day after day, something that would create a habit, a routine, an emotional connection that went beyond the simple transaction of selling soap powder. They wanted to become part of the daily lives of American housewives in a way that no advertisement had ever achieved before. The answer came in the form of serialized drama, stories that continued from day to day, with characters that listeners could come to know and care about, with plots that unfolded gradually over weeks and months and years. The format was not entirely new. Serialized fiction had been popular in newspapers and magazines for generations, going back to Dickens and before. But no one had quite applied the formula to radio advertising in the systematic way that the soap companies would now pioneer. On August 14th, 1933, a new program debuted on radio station WLW in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was called Ma Perkins, and it told the story of a widowed woman running a lumberyard in a small town, dealing with the ordinary problems and minor dramas of everyday life in America. The sponsor was Procter & Gamble, and the product being advertised was Oxydol soap powder. The program would become known, sometimes as Oxydol's own Ma Perkins, a title that made the commercial relationship completely explicit. A young actress named Virginia Payne took on the role of Ma Perkins at the age of 23. She would play the character for the entire run of the program, never missing a single performance over nearly 3 decades. The show moved to the NBC network on December 4th of that same year, reaching a national audience of millions. It would continue on NBC until 1949, then move to CBS and run until 1960, a span of 27 years during which the fictional Ma Perkins became as real and familiar to many listeners as their own neighbours and relatives. The format worked beyond anyone's expectations. Listeners became emotionally invested in the characters and their situations. They tuned in day after day to follow the continuing storylines, to find out what would happen next, to share in the small triumphs and setbacks of lives that felt recognisably ordinary, and yet somehow more dramatic than their own. And between the story segments, they heard about Oxydol. They heard about its cleaning power, its whitening ability, its value for the family budget. The commercial messages were woven into the fabric of the entertainment so thoroughly that separating them became almost impossible. The psychological mechanics were remarkably similar to the hygiene advertising that had preceded it. The shame-based campaigns for Listerine and Lifebuoy had worked by creating anxiety and then offering relief, by making consumers feel inadequate and then providing a product that promised to solve the problem. The radio dramas worked by creating emotional tension and then providing resolution, by making listeners feel invested in characters and then rewarding that investment with satisfying story developments. Both relied on the same basic principle of emotional manipulation, of creating a need and then fulfilling it, of making people feel something and then channeling that feeling toward a commercial purpose. The success of Ma Perkins spawned imitators almost immediately. Other soap companies launched their own daytime dramas, their own serialized stories designed to capture the attention of housewives and keep them listening through the commercial breaks. Lever Brothers, Colgate-Palmolive, and other manufacturers of household cleaning products followed Procter & Gamble into the radio drama business. The networks filled their daytime schedules with these programs, and the sponsors paid handsomely for the privilege of associating their brands with popular entertainment. The genre needed a name, and the name it received captured its commercial origins perfectly. Journalists and critics began calling these daytime dramas soap operas, a term that acknowledged both their melodramatic content and their sponsorship by soap manufacturers. The name stuck. It would outlast the radio era entirely, following the format as it migrated to television and then to streaming services, always carrying with it the memory of its origins in the advertising strategies of Depression-era soap companies. The connection between soap operas and hygiene anxiety ran deeper than mere sponsorship. The emotional manipulation pioneered in the shame-based advertising of the 1920s had created a template, a psychological toolbox that the radio dramatists now applied to entertainment. The techniques that had taught consumers to feel anxious about their breath and their body odour were refined and expanded into techniques for making audiences feel anxious about fictional characters and their fictional problems. The same advertising agencies that had created the campaigns for Listerine and Lifebuoy now created the storylines for Ma Perkins and her successors. The skills transferred seamlessly from one application to the other. It has been estimated that over the 27-year run of Ma Perkins, the program helped sell more than 3 billion boxes of Oxydol soap powder. 3 billion boxes. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. Each of those boxes represented a moment of purchase, a decision by a consumer to choose Oxydol over its competitors, a transaction driven in some measure by the emotional connection that the radio drama had created. The entertainment and the advertising had become so thoroughly intertwined that separating their effects was no longer possible. The soap companies found the medium so profitable that they eventually moved beyond mere sponsorship. They began producing their own programs directly, controlling every aspect of the content from the storylines to the casting to the commercial integration. Procter & Gamble became one of the largest producers of daytime programming in America, a soap company that was also an entertainment company, selling both cleaning products and emotional experiences to the same audience of American housewives. The format evolved over the decades. The storylines became more complex, the production values more sophisticated, the emotional manipulation more refined. But the basic structure remained the same: serialized drama designed to create ongoing engagement, interrupted by commercial messages for household products, funded by companies that had learned to profit from the psychological needs and anxieties of consumers. The soap opera became a dominant form of American popular entertainment, spawning thousands of hours of programming and launching the careers of countless actors and writers and producers. And it all traced back, through a surprisingly direct line, to the same impulse that had driven the hygiene anxiety campaigns of the 1920s. The manufacturers who had learned to make people afraid of their own bodies had discovered that the same techniques could make people emotionally invested in fictional characters. The advertising that had taught consumers to wash compulsively out of fear of social rejection had evolved into entertainment that kept audiences tuning in day after day out of emotional attachment to imaginary lives. The cynical manipulation of human psychology that Semmelweis would have found incomprehensible had become the foundation of an entire entertainment industry. Rest now with this strange connection. The hands that Semmelweis begged physicians to wash, the hands that the advertising agencies taught consumers to scrub compulsively, those same hands now turned the radio dial to hear the latest episode of Ma Perkins. The anxiety about contamination and cleanliness that the soap companies had cultivated so carefully had been transformed into anxiety about fictional characters and their fictional problems. The emotional energy flowed along the same channels, activated the same psychological mechanisms, generated the same profits for the same corporations. The soap sits in its dish. The radio plays in the kitchen. The story continues day after day, episode after episode, for decades at a time. The line between the product and the entertainment has dissolved entirely. The soap company is the entertainment company. The advertisement is the program. The anxiety and the relief, the problem and the solution, the fear and the purchase all blur together into a single seamless experience that shapes the daily lives of millions of American families. And now, the long view opens before us. The centuries fall away, and we can see the whole strange journey from beginning to end. Roman citizens washing their hands before sacred rituals, not because they understood germs, but because the gods demanded cleanliness as a mark of piety and respect. The aqueducts carrying water into the great public baths, the steam rising from heated pools, the social mingling of bodies that had been washed and scrubbed and oiled. The religious understanding of cleanliness as a transition between worlds, a passage from the ordinary to the divine, a preparation for approaching the sacred. Then, the long unwashing, the aqueducts falling silent as the empire crumbled, the Christian suspicion of the body, the celebration of holy filth, the saints who refused to bathe as a mark of spiritual devotion, the medieval centuries when washing became a rare luxury, when cities reeked of human waste and the Thames and the Seine ran thick with offal and sewage. The miasma theory that blamed bad air for disease, that missed the connection between contamination and infection, that left physicians helpless against the plagues that swept through populations with terrifying regularity. Then Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician with his basin of chlorinated lime, his careful records, his devastating insight that physicians' hands were carrying death from the morgue to the maternity ward. The resistance and the rejection, the colleagues who refused to believe that gentlemen's hands could cause disease, the slow martyrdom of a man who could not convince the world of a truth that would later seem obvious, the asylum and the beating and the infection that killed him at 47, the same kind of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. Then the vindication that came too late. Pasteur's demonstration that microorganisms cause disease, Koch's identification of specific bacteria responsible for specific illnesses, Lister's antiseptic methods transforming surgery from a death sentence into a healing art, the gradual acceptance of germ theory, the slow spread of hand-washing through medical practice, the hospitals and wards that finally adopted the procedures Semmelweis had begged them to use decades earlier, then the transformation. The soap companies discovering that hygiene could be marketed, that fear could be manufactured and sold, that the genuine medical insight about cleanliness could be twisted into a source of endless consumer anxiety. The advertising campaigns that taught people to feel ashamed of their bodies, that invented new conditions and new fears, that turned washing from a health practice into a social necessity. The radio dramas funded by soap money, the emotional manipulation refined into entertainment, the genre that still carries the name of its commercial origins even now. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in early 2020, and suddenly hand-washing returned to its original urgent register. For a brief moment, the world remembered what Semmelweis had known, what the germ theorists had proven, what the advertising had obscured beneath layers of manufactured anxiety. Washing hands could prevent the spread of disease. Clean hands could save lives. The insight that had cost a Hungarian physician his sanity and his life was suddenly on every public health poster, every news broadcast, every government recommendation. People scrubbed their hands raw. Hand sanitizer became a commodity, then a status symbol, then eventually a meme. The shelves emptied of soap and disinfectant. The rituals of cleanliness that the advertising had cultivated for a century suddenly had genuine medical urgency behind them again. For a moment, The manufactured anxiety and the real necessity aligned perfectly. People washed their hands because they were genuinely afraid of a genuine threat, not because they feared social rejection or had been taught to feel inadequate about their bodies. But even that moment passed. The pandemic receded, or at least became familiar. The hand sanitizer that had been hoarded and treasured was left half-used in desk drawers and car cup holders. The habits that had seemed so urgent relaxed back into routine. The Semmelweisian register, the life and death understanding of hand hygiene, faded once again into the background noise of consumer culture. People kept washing their hands, but the urgency dissipated, replaced by the familiar mixture of habit and vague anxiety and social expectation that had characterized hygiene behavior for generations. The question remains. It has remained throughout this entire journey, from the Roman aqueducts to the pandemic stockpiles of hand sanitizer. Do we wash our hands because we understand why? Do we scrub and rinse and dry because we have internalized the germ theory, because we comprehend the invisible microorganisms that Pasteur demonstrated and Koch identified, because we have absorbed the insight that Semmelweis died defending? Or do we wash because we were taught to be afraid? Because the advertising created anxieties, and the entertainment reinforced habits, and the social expectations became so ingrained that we no longer remember where they came from? The answer, perhaps, is that both are true. The genuine medical knowledge exists, real and validated and supported by more than a century of scientific evidence. Washing hands prevents disease. Soap and clean water are among the most effective public health interventions ever discovered. The insight that cost Semmelweis everything has been proven correct beyond any reasonable doubt. Anyone who takes the time to understand germ theory can comprehend why hand washing matters, can trace the connection from contaminated surfaces through unwashed hands to vulnerable bodies, can appreciate the simple, profound truth that cleaning prevents infection. But layered on top of that genuine knowledge is all the manufactured anxiety, all the advertising-induced shame, all the social pressure and consumer culture and emotional manipulation that the soap companies pioneered and refined over the past century. The two are almost impossible to separate now. The real reason to wash and the manufactured reasons have become so thoroughly intertwined that most people cannot distinguish between them. We wash because of germs and because of advertisements, because of Semmelweis and because of Listerine, because of genuine health knowledge and because of artificial social fears, and perhaps that is simply how human beings are. Perhaps we have always needed both knowledge and fear, both understanding and anxiety, to motivate the behaviors that keep us healthy and alive. The Romans washed before approaching the gods not because they understood contamination, but because religious ritual demanded it, and the washing served them well regardless of their reasons. The medieval Europeans who avoided bathing did so for religious and cultural reasons that made sense within their worldview, even though the actual consequences were devastating. The consumers who scrub compulsively because advertising taught them to be afraid are still preventing the spread of disease, even if their motivation has been manufactured and manipulated. Semmelweis understood the truth. He saw clearly that washing hands saved lives, and he spent his career trying to convince others of what he knew. The tragedy is that he was right, and that being right was not enough. The greater tragedy, perhaps, is that his insight was eventually accepted, not because people understood it, but because people were taught to fear the alternatives, not because germ theory became widely comprehended, but because anxiety became profitable. The soap still sits in its dish, the water still runs warm from the tap, the hands are washed countless times a day by billions of people around the world. Some wash because they understand, some wash because they were trained to feel unclean if they don't. Most wash without thinking about it at all, the behaviour so automatic and ingrained that the reasons have become invisible, lost in the accumulated layers of medical knowledge and commercial manipulation and social expectation. The river of human behaviour flows ever onward. The same hands that once reached towards sacred altars in Rome, the same hands that went unwashed through the medieval centuries, the same hands that Semmelweis tried desperately to convince his colleagues to clean, those hands now reach towards soap dispensers and hand sanitizer bottles without a second thought. The gesture has become so ordinary, so automatic, that its extraordinary history has been almost completely forgotten. But the history remains. The Roman rituals and the Christian ascetics, the miasma theory and the Black Death, the Vienna maternity ward and the basin of chlorinated lime, the asylum and the vindication, The advertising and the anxiety, the radio dramas and their commercial sponsorship, all of it remains encoded in the simple daily act of washing hands. Every time we turn on the tap and reach for the soap, we are completing a gesture that stretches back through centuries of human effort and error, through tragedy and triumph, through genuine insight and cynical exploitation. The credits roll now on this long, strange story. From aqueducts to algorithms, from sacred rituals to soap operas, from a martyred Hungarian physician to the algorithms that recommend hand sanitizer in your online shopping cart, the thread runs unbroken. The question of what is clean and who gets to define it and who profits from the answer has been asked and re-answered in every generation, and each answer has shaped the world that followed. Tonight, when you wash your hands before sleep, let the water run warm over your fingers. Feel the soap lather between your palms. Think, if you wish, of all the hands that have made this same gesture throughout human history, for reasons as varied as religious devotion and manufactured shame and genuine medical necessity. Think of Semmelweis, dying in the asylum, his hands clean but his heart broken by a world that refused to listen. Think of the advertising executives who turned his insight into profit. Think of the radio voices that sold soap powder between dramatic plot twists, and then let it go. Let the water carry it all away, the knowledge and the anxiety, the history and the habit. The hands are clean now for whatever reason, from whatever motivation. The gesture is complete. The ancient ritual, the medical intervention, the consumer behaviour, all collapse into the same simple motion of soap and water and skin. Sleep well tonight. Let the gentle flow of centuries carry you into rest. The soap companies still sell their products. The medical knowledge still saves lives. The manufactured anxieties still create profits. The truth that Semmelweis discovered still holds, whether or not anyone remembers his name. The water runs, the soap lathers, the hands are washed, and somewhere, in the vast accumulated weight of human history, a Hungarian physician who died alone and broken finally receives the only tribute that would have mattered to him. The simple acknowledgement that he was right, that clean hands save lives, that the insight he could not prove in his lifetime has become so fundamental to human behaviour that we no longer even think about why we do it. The tap turns off, the hands dry on a soft towel, the light dims. Rest now. The story is complete. Dream of clean water and gentle soap, of rivers flowing through centuries, of hands reaching toward each other across the vast distances of time. Sleep well. And in the morning, when you wash your hands again, perhaps you will remember just for a moment how long and strange and costly the journey was that brought you to the basin. Or perhaps you will simply wash, as billions do every day, without thinking about it at all. Either way, the hands will be clean. Either way, the insight holds. Either way, Semmelweis was right. Good night.